So welcome everyone to Istanbul Topkapı University Department of English Language and Literature's first annual International Conference on Literature. I am Furkan Tozan and I will be moderating the first session today. This year's theme is Human Rights and Literature, as you all know, and we will have 26 academics from around the world throughout the sessions that span today and tomorrow to give their presentation on various aspects of how human rights and literature reflect, influence, and synergize with one another. And to commence today's session, it's my honor to invite Dr. Pema SAMDUP from Indira Gandhi National Open University to give today's keynote speech. Dr. SAMDUP, you have the floor.
Thank you, Furkan. It's my honor to be with you, and I hope I can share something that makes sense to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd actually like to share my screen if it's possible.
Yes, absolutely. I think you can now.
Yeah, thanks so much. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, okay. Basically, today I would like to look at two branches of philosophy, which is the aesthetics and the ethics. And why I'm looking at these two branches is because we are trying to talk about literature and human rights. And the aesthetics, as you know, would be looking at what is beautiful, what is ugly, what is gruesome, what is awesome. That provides the arts part of it, which is our literature. And the ethics part of it is looked after by what is known as human rights. So basically what we're trying to do is, I'm not going to be telling you something earth-shatteringly new. I'm just going to share my own experience with this relationship between literature and human rights. So we're going to look at one of the interdisciplinary methods of trying to teach human rights or even generating an awareness of human rights through literature, and particularly by looking at three genres, which is the novel, the short story, and poetry. And the focus is on communities, women, marginalized, etc. Now, before that, I think we need to look at very, very quickly at the development of human rights, because as students of literature, most of us are not really aware of it. Right, so the Magna Carta was issued in 1215. The Thomas Paine's Rights of Man came out in 1791. Now we would know all these things individually, but we would not actually correlate it or kind of look at it as a progression to what finally came out as the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Then we had the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen in 1789. The American Civil War, which saw the abolition of slavery between 1861 and 65. And finally, at the end of World War II, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Beyond that, we've had the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in 1966. We've had the Convention on the eradication of all forms of racial discrimination. We've had, the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, against torture and other cruel, degrading treatments or punishment, and rights of the child. And we do realize that these rights and conventions will continue to be added through the passage of time. Now, basically what I'm trying to look at is, can there be an interface at all between literature and human rights? Is it a likely interface? Is it totally unlikely? What kind of a relationship can be shared between these two seemingly disparate streams of thought? Now, we also have a huge body of literature called human rights literature. What does it connote? Basically, it connotes a commitment to society. And it looks at an individual's responsibility and the ability to foster in a social change. It stems basically from Jean-Paul Sartre's ideas that, it is perfectly fine and right for normal, common people to take a stand vis-a-vis any sort of a political conflict. And it also goes on to add that literature just is not art for art's sake. It looks at something bigger. It serves a larger purpose. And of course, the hope that literature would somehow try and enable the marginalized, the subalterns to speak. And the privileged ones would somehow take cognizance of what the subaltern has to say and are motivated enough to take corrective or affirmative action. Human rights is essentially about human dignity and human worth. All right, it includes all kinds of rights, such as moral rights, natural rights, legal rights, so on and so forth, including fourth generation rights, such as the right to self-determination, development, humanitarian assistance. It includes sexual, ethnic, religious, and linguistic minority rights as well. So having said that, I was struck by two people. One was Lindsay Stonebridge, who's interdisciplinary professor of humanities and human rights at the University of Birmingham. And then the other was the political scientist, author, commentator, Professor Melissa Perry, who seems to suggest that if you really want to read and understand political science, then there has to be a kind of a novel at the center. So what she's trying to advocate is that in order to understand very, very abstract political concepts, like human rights, for example, if there is a novel or there is something in literature that can actually, show you or explain the same thing to you in a different matter, that is what is important. And that is how it should be done. Now, that's a very, very progressive view because as far as I recall, at least in our country, these are very separate departments. And interdisciplinary studies is something that is still, in its very nascent stage. And we don't really look at crossing over boundaries and trying to do an interdisciplinary thing. Pramod K. Nair, he's an Indian scholar and an academic. He has compiled a kind of a bibliography for the Oxford Bibliography Online on Literature and Literary and Critical Theory. And he has talked a lot about human rights and literature, the nexus, the connection, the intimacy, the relationship between the two. Now, having said that, let me quickly come down to some of the literary texts that I would actually like to share with you. Now, this particular
Professor, sorry for interrupting. Are you moving the slides? Because we
I am. Is it not showing? It's not showing?
We can only see the cover.
Is this?
Now we can see it.
So if I keep it small, I can,
Yeah, please. Thank you.
Now we're looking at Gopinath Mohanty, who's an Odia writer. And in the next slide, you will see where Odisha is in India. Right? This novel was written in Odia in 1945. It was translated into English much later in 1987. And it talks about a particular tribe from the state of Odisha. A typical story where there is a widow with 4 children. And even though they're not well off, they live a normal, relatively happy life. But soon all kinds of troubles begin to plague them. And it is basically because of state authority. There is a forest god who has been, whose sexual advances have been rejected by the daughter of the old man. And because of that, he goes into this whole, machination of making their lives miserable. So at the end, what happens is the father and one of the sons become a bonded laborer, a goti, something like a modern day slave. So their story depicts a realistic picture of a life of hardship, poverty, loneliness, alienation, loss of connect with the land because they need to sell their land, the degradation of human relationships, all sorts of things. When you read the novel, you realize that there is only, tragedy in a sense. And the subaltern voice is heard only at the very end of the novel, when the older son kills the moneylender and then he surrenders himself in the police station. Now, in a way, it shows us the nature of survival, the different types of existence, the realities that people face daily about life, survival. And it also talks about exploitation against the oppressive forces of the state machinery and the social system. And at the same time, it talks about undying hope. Now, this particular place, Orissa, is where the novel is from. Now, after this, we shall move on to the next novel. I'm sorry, I have to do this very quickly because it's just a 10-minute presentation. The next novel that I've looked at is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which was published in 1958. So from India, we have now moved on to Africa and Nigeria to be particular. Now, the novel talks about the clash of cultures. It talks about misunderstandings. It talks about marginalization. It talks about discrimination of certain people. It talks about exile, which are all, contradictory to the human rights, various articles of the Human Rights Declaration. It talks about issues of social inclusion or exclusion, a lot of things that are there. From there on, we look at Toni Morrison, who's an African-American writer. We moved on to America. And her novel, The Bluest Eye, is what I looked at. This was published in 1970. Now, the theme of, most of you would know it, the theme is basically tragic effects of the psychological trauma of the foisting and the acceptance of white American ideals of beauty by a young Black girl during the early 1940s. And what does the novel talk about? It talks about the denial and the devaluation of Black people. It almost seems to, suggest that Black lives do not matter. Their worth is not recognized. They're not recognized as people. And there is a lack of acknowledgement of the basic humanity of Black or the people of color. Now, it also raises very interesting questions on how did Blacks perceive themselves? Was it Black as ugly, something to be ashamed of and to run away from? Hence, the only solution lies in trying to assimilate with white society. Did they look at Black as beautiful? Or was it Black as neither ugly nor beautiful, but Black as just Black? So, in this particular novel, Pecola Breedlove is that little girl who dreams of having the bluest eyes, because for her, that is the hallmark of beauty. She is humiliated, picked on, beaten, verbally abused, sexually abused. Her parents are victims of racism themselves, yet the parents also victimize the girl, as the mother always withholds her love for her daughter. And her father is in a very strange place because he loves her, but the manner of his love is so inappropriate because he actually sexually assaults and rapes her and leaves her pregnant with his child. Right? So, these are all, if you really look at the novel and you read it carefully, you will realize that these are all various types of human rights violations. And it doesn't come across as something that is just a violation. When you read the novel, it is a story which talks about so many things. So you tend to, as a literature person, you tend to look at it from a different point of view. You might look at it from the point of view of, let's say, a post-colonial reading, a gender reading, a psychological reading, all kinds of things. But we don't normally move towards looking at it from a human rights point of view. So that is why I was looking at some of these more common novels that everybody would know to serve this purpose. From there on, we look very quickly at Nadine Gordimer. Now we moved to Africa again and South Africa. And the reason why I did Chinua Achebe earlier and moved to, again, came back to Africa is because I was following the chronology of the publications. So Nadine Gordimer was a middle-class white South African. And she began reading at a very early stage in life. And through her readings, she became aware of this whole thing of the color bar, of the apartheid, which was in effect in South Africa between 1948 and 1994. So most of her works, deal with themes of exile, themes of alienation. She, of course, received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1991. And this particular collection, I took this because it was a different genre and it's, shorter. So this anthology deals with the love between men and women, Black and white. Okay, the angst, the sorrows they undergo as interpersonal relationships are always affected by the color bar that they present. And it also brings at a different level, if you look at the issues that are dealt with in the short stories in this particular anthology or across Nadine Gordimer's writings, you realize that we can almost compare it to our Indian caste system. There it was race. In India, we have this caste system, the social system, whereby a particular caste is at the bottom of the hierarchy, which is now known as the Dalits. And the way the Dalit women were treated and are still treated in many parts of the country, you can draw very good parallels between the apartheid and the position of the Black woman and the Indian Dalit woman. And the color bar depicted in this particular story from which the anthology takes its name, 6 Feet of the Country, it kind of gives you the impression that a sexual encounter or a sexual relationship, whether between a Black woman and a white man, whether it is by mutual decision or whether it is a forced relationship, is okay. But they cannot be anything more than a sexual encounter between a white woman, a man, and a Black woman. And this is a similar kind of story that happens with the Dalit woman in India. From there on, we move again to Africa, to Australia, where we look at one of the Aboriginal writers. Now, earlier she was known as Cat Walker, but she took on the name of her Aboriginal name, which is Otgurunimikul. Okay. And Otgurunimikul, she was engaged in the support of Aboriginal rights, social justice, conservationism. She used to fight for causes such as the agitation leading to voting rights. Now, we have to remember, right up to 1965 in Australia, Aboriginals and, didn't have citizenship. We didn't have any voting rights, right? Now, the Australian citizenship right for Aborigines happened only in 1967. So her particular poem, this one, it's called We Are Going. Most of you would know about it because it was published in 1964. And if you're interested in Australian literature or in, Indigenous writings, you would have definitely come across this particular poem. It's one of the most quoted poems. So in this particular short poem, what she's trying to talk about is the agony of being dispossessed, the angst of now being a decimated tribe as they stand silent and subdued. They struggle to maintain their cultural activities and integrity, but the Aborigines appear to be fighting a losing battle. And as yet, even though they feel this loss, they sense this sorrow, they're silent. Their voices are unheard. They are the marginalized, the subaltern who cannot speak. Now, if you look at the last 4 lines of the poem, where she says, the scrubs are gone, the haunted and the hunting and the laughter. The eagle is gone, the emu and the kangaroo are gone from this place. The borering is gone, the corroboree is gone, and we are going. What, in a sense, she's trying to say is eventually all of their cultural practices, all of the cultural aspects that make them who they are is going to disappear, right? It's going to be obliterated. So this actually, many of the agitations by the Aboriginal people led to the Australian Prime Minister making a public apology in 2008. So her poem is basically a lament for the ending of a way of life, an era of a certain cultural civilization. Right? And this was the public apology made to the Aborigines of Australia and the Torres Strait Islanders. If you do a net search, you will find it. It's a very long document. I've just taken a bit of it. Now, from there on, we move to another Australian Aboriginal writer. He was known as Colin Johnson, but he too took on his Aboriginal name, which is Mudruru. And the reason why, he's actually a bit of a controversial figure because his Aboriginality is or was being questioned. But because he has contributed tremendously to Australian literature and the manner in which he actually looked upon literature as a tool for Indigenous people to use for empowerment and to bring about social and political justice. That's the reason I've included him here. And also because this particular poem talks about the Dalits in India. Now, it is Harijan, which, Mahatma Gandhi, the father of the Indian nation, so to speak, was the one who named the untouchables. Earlier, they were known as the untouchables, and there are various names in different languages for them. So he named them Harijan. Harijan basically is composed of 2 words, Hari, which is God, and Jan as in children. So they were known as the children of God. So this particular poem is what it's trying to tell us is that, when Gandhiji fought for freedom, freedom for him meant that freeing everybody, including the Dalits who were subjugated by the other upper castes of Indian society. They were not allowed to enter places of worship. They were not allowed to live where the others live. They were, segregated totally. They could not take on any jobs except manual scavenging, which was part of their work. And they were not allowed to drink from shared well, a common well or anything like that. They were not supposed to be on the road when people walked by. So he realized that freedom meant freeing all of them. So he ensured that, all public places of worship were open to them. He even started scavenging himself to kind of try and restore their human dignity. But despite legislation, despite revisions in the Constitution, it still exists in various villages, in various rural areas, and to a lesser extent in the cities of India, even 75 years after independence. So the poem seems to suggest that while Gandhiji renamed them from untouchables and made them the chosen ones or God's children, the paradise that they should have got, the paradise that was promised to them, is unattainable to them. And they do not seem to see any kind of a brighter tomorrow. And in fact, the poem suggests that, if at all they find liberation, it will be largely through their own efforts. Now, this is a thing, that even as late as October 2022, they were still being called untouchable. So a lot of them embraced Buddhism. So there's always this mass conversion taking place. So here we have some of the Dalit writers. This is Bama, her novel is Kurukku. Then you have Arjun Dangle, his most famous life writing autobiography is Poison Bread. Then you have Limale, who wrote The Outcast. Now, apart from that, I also wanted to touch upon another section of India, which is the northeast portion, if you can see where my arrow is. And there was a lot of insurgency, right? Now, insurgency, on the one hand, where the state machinery would call it insurgency. On the other hand, for those who were trying to, let's say, fight for their freedom or their right to self-determination, it is a different narrative altogether, different discourses. But anyway, through discourses that take place, there was a lot of, let's say, human rights violations of all kinds. Because there were certain laws, rules passed. There is the AFSA Act, which means the military cannot be questioned about what they're doing or not doing in certain states, wherever the rule is imposed. So Nagaland went through a very long history of this so-called insurgency, and on the other hand, the right to self-determination. Now, Tensula Au, she was born in 1945. She passed away last year, October 22. She is one of the earliest writers from Nagaland who wrote in English. So she is basically a poet. She has 7 anthologies of poetry, but she also has 3 collections of short stories. And the one that I wanted to look at is this text here. Which is called These Hills Called Home, Stories from the War Zone. It was published in 2005. Now, there are 10 stories in this particular collection, and it deals with, like I said, insurgency in England. Okay. And for the Naga people, of course, it was the right to self-determination. And in her short stories, she talks about the everyday lives of the Nagas that is constantly blurred between this insurgency, counterinsurgency, and the way she writes. You see it's very, her writing is very raw. And as yet, the stories depict the brutality of the Indian state and what it can do and it's not just with the insurgents. The brunt of it is also felt by the common people, the commoners, right? And the commoners are in in a very peculiar position, because if they do not, facilitate or assist the insurgents, whether they want monetary contributions, whether they want food, whether they want shelter, they want medical assistance, whatever, if they do not support them, right, they're looked upon as being traitors to the cause. If they support them, the military will...
Professor, I'm sorry for interrupting again. Can everyone else please turn off their microphones? Thank you.
So, like I was saying, their position is very, very peculiar, as it happens across Furkan, you could probably mute everybody.
Yeah, Sarah is doing that right now. I don't
Anyway.
have the privilege to do so. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so coming back. So, you know, like I was saying, the common person is always caught up in this very, very peculiar position. Because I remember I come from West Bengal, which is again very close to the northeast part of India. And around 1987, we had this whole thing, again, the right to self-determination in our area, which was called the Gorkhaland agitation. The Nepalese population of that area wanted to carve out a state for themselves from West Bengal. So we had what the state would call the insurgents on the one side and the state machinery on the other. So the insurgents would carry out guerrilla warfare and stuff. And as the citizens of that area, we were supposed to, you know, attend meetings, support their cause, give monetary contributions, and all of that. If we didn't do that, you were immediately looked upon as being a supporter of the state, right? So you were already being marginalized and targeted at the same time. And if you supported and showed sympathy and were seen as being helping the insurgents, then the state machinery could crack down on you very severely. So the common person always is caught in such kind of zone. And basically I was trying to explain the kind of situation that gives birth to many of the stories of Peninsula Al in the anthology called These Hills Called Home. So the stories are very, very gruesome at times. They have horrific descriptions of torture, oppression. But at the same time, you know, in her stories, there is also the beauty of it. There is a kind of resistance. There is a kind of resilience that individuals, ordinary people, can still kind of take a stand against the might of an oppressive state in their own little ways. So I'll just show you a few slides, which is basically talking about the ravages of war. Now, war is one area where human rights are violated left, right, and center. Whether it is a huge war or whether it is like the military has a whole jargon, different kinds of words to use. Like, you know, if it's a small thing in a state, it is known by a different name, a skirmish, okay? If it is between two bodies that have the might, the military might to actually kind of go on for a protracted period of time, it has a different term, and so on and so forth. But basically, war is one area that leads to hundreds of violations of human rights. And it also gives birth to something called war literature, which again can be used, like for instance, the Holocaust literature. That is another area that we can explore. And in conclusion, let us just try and say that human rights discourse, you know, it helps us make sense of literature in a different way. Because like I said, as students of literature, we do not look at human rights as theory. Right? We look at various theories, we try and apply it to our text, we try and read our text in different ways and interpret it in different ways, but we don't really look at human rights as a way of reading into the text. And but what we don't realize, you know, in retrospect, what I realize is what we ourselves don't realize is literature actually gives us the scope to look at so many of these different aspects of human rights. But we don't do it because that's not our training, right? And especially given the history of colonization in many parts of the globe and the brutalities and horrors of colonization, you know, when we try and do a human rights reading of a text, it helps us examine the shared trauma of people. And if you do a more detailed study of the text that I've highlighted, or there are many more texts that you can take, I just chose the more familiar and the ones that have been around for some time. You do get a very, very good understanding of how rights are violated. You don't need a war for rights to be violated. And in fact, you know, this particular quotation I found in the Times of India, it's old. It's about 8 years old, but I found it very interesting because it was talking about how Black men in America are changing the way they dress. Because, and I quote, being Black in America has always been very hard. African Americans are automatically considered violent criminals and lawbreakers. So obviously the police look at them in a different way. So what are they trying to do to escape the hostile gaze of the police and to kind of give, the impression of being non-threatening? They're changing their attire. Now, if I would say this is a very sad state of affairs for us human beings, right? And through literature, we can, look at these aspects, we can highlight these aspects and try and make changes in small ways. Make sure that we don't need a war, like I said, that we ourselves are not doing something that goes against somebody else's human rights. Like even in our country or even in Turkey, the other day I was watching some OTT series and I didn't realize that Turkey also had a huge body of Jews at some point in time. And there was almost a Holocaustic kind of relationship there. So all of us have that. In India, we have it at different levels because we have so many states trying to carve out a state for themselves, the right to self-determination. So we have that. On the other hand, we have Dalits who are still being ill-treated. So that kind of a thing is happening day in and day out. But as students of literature, we really need to be a little more aware. And I conclude in the words of Gayatri Spivak, who says basically that human rights is something that we cannot not want. So I end my presentation here.
Professor SAMDUP, thank you so much for this beautiful coverage of our theme this year. And if anyone has any comments or questions to pose, please feel free to do so. Or if you don't feel like turning on your microphone, you can type it down in the chat box and I can read it out loud. And if not, we can move on with the presentations. Thank you so much, Professor SAMDUP, for the keynote speech today. Oh,
thank you very much.
I think we have a question or a comment from Dr. Professor SULJIĆ.
Do we have time? Actually, if we have time, I would have. We have
we have a little time.
Okay.
So
Dr. Pema, I really enjoyed your presentation, but I've got a short question. You referred to war in Afghanistan, and I just want to hear your comments about the possible relation between the radical, kind of religionism and human rights. Would you like to talk about it? Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, but you were slightly wrong. I did not refer to the Afghan war. I was just showing you some pictures of war because I was trying to see, that was I remember that slide. It is a book called, just give me a second. I think it's a book called Afghanistan War by Ryan Worrell. So I was just, I just put that picture up because I was trying to kind of explain how war is one area where human rights are trampled upon right, left, and center. All right, and as far as your question goes about religious, what was it, fundamentalism or freedom? What was it that you were asking about?
I mean that fundamentalism, it is the basic reason of violation in many Middle East countries. Maybe we can talk about the role of extremism, fundamentalism, and Afghanistan is one of the big victims of that, actually.
As far as my understanding of Afghanistan goes, and I've interacted with a number of Afghan refugees who've taken shelter in India, Afghanistan was not really a fundamentalist country in that sense. They were pretty liberal. It was only when the Taliban came in that this whole problem arose, and fundamentalism took on a whole new color by itself. Now, the way I see it, the minute religious fundamentalism comes into play, or like some of my friends are very clear about it, as soon as religion enters anything, and people start, becoming more and more, and it's very easy for people actually, for those who want to exploit religion to serve their purpose, it is very easy for them to convince people. So fundamentalism in any form, whether it is in Afghanistan, whether it is in India, whether it is Islamic fundamentalism or Hindu fundamentalism, because that's something that is kind of gathering some momentum here, is a very, very dangerous position or a place to be in. Because that, in a sense, like you rightly pointed out, impacts human rights to a very, very large extent.
Oh, thank you very much. I completely agree with you. I'm a dual citizen of Turkey and Iran, and I just heard that during the last week, more than 10 people just executed for having just some comments on the religious views, and it is so sad. We are holding human rights conference, and that's why I just want to ask you, what is your comment about fundamentalism and human rights? Thank you very much. Yeah.
You're welcome.
If you don't have any more comments or questions, I will move along with the presentations.
Thank you.
Just take a quick look over. Thank you so much, Professor. Okay, so our first presentation for the first session will be by Dr. Selena ÖZBAŞ from İstanbul University. Selena ÖZBAŞ holds a doctoral degree from Istanbul University, Department of English Language and Literature. She is an assistant professor at Istanbul University, Department of English Language and Literature. Her main research interests include humor studies and cognitive literary studies, with a special emphasis on late medieval to mid-18th century English literature. And she will be giving her presentation titled Self, Soliloquy, and the Form of the Sentimental Novel. Dr. ÖZBAŞ, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would like to start with Anthony Ashley Cooper. And so in his soliloquy, or advice to an author, the third Earl of Shaftesbury makes a highly significant late 17th century contribution to the eudaimonian approach to the self. So he begins the discourse by contrasting the futility of external advice to the internal value of one's being able to develop the ability to give advice to herself or himself, or better put, the internal value of self-advice. Because he believes the giver advice usually indulges in nothing other than taking an opportunity to show our own wisdom at someone else's expense. So not only does she partake in the facetious business of self-satisfaction in the hope of acquiring a means of self-flattery, but also the taker of advice finds it hard in himself or herself to receive this piece of advice as a generous gift, since human beings willingly learn whatever else they are taught, and they can bear someone else's being their master in mathematics, in music, or in any other science, but not in understanding and good sense. So to overcome this difficulty, Shaftesbury delivers a long exposition of the importance of self-scrutiny, and the act of self-scrutiny, in his opinion, is heavily dependent on the ability to soliloquize in the manner of the modern dramatic poets, who allow the wrongdoing person to criticize himself unsparingly and thoroughly, going through the business of self-dissection. For soliloquizing allows a person to divide herself or himself and know herself as advised by the Delphic inscription, which gives the unspoken language of our thoughts a voice and accent. And in other words, it emerges as a means of self-discovery by digging down into ourselves that allows a certain doubleness of soul. But the duplexity of soul that is perpetrated by this act of soliloquizing is not a matter of duplicity or a pretextual hypocrisy. On the contrary, Shaftesbury attaches a certain poetic and philosophical importance to soliloquy, through which a person becomes two distinct persons, pupil and instructor, learning and teaching. And so the matter of dividing the soul appears to be perfectly aligned with Shaftesbury's doctrine of two persons in a single self, which connotes the human self's intrinsic means of personal education and contemplation, because he believes charity begins at home, and accordingly he arrives at the very eudaimonic conclusion that wisdom also begins at home. So, I mean, this project of self-centeredness is sometimes easily misconstrued, or it can be easily misconstrued as part of an egotistical and deceptive project, or a lopsided commentary on the contra-individuality of the human self, as opposed to the culture of public scrutiny of the 18th century. Or alternatively speaking, it could seem hard to imagine an overlap between this self-centeredness and his deistic sentiments, under whose rule the universe becomes a rationally charged creation, whose very firmament is nothing but the making of divine care and order. However, I guess we should note with great care that both his emphasis on individuality and on the divine design of the universe is simply made subservient to virtuous practice. And so, because not only does his unique sense of individualism negate the selfishness and malevolence of Hobbes's man and purport a versified benevolence, but also it negates the superiority of divine aesthetics by offering a scheme of virtue without religion. And in this context, the specific compliment he pays to virtuous activity, and not a virtuous disposition in that sense, exquisitely fits into his veneration of human good and happiness as the ultimate result of a virtue in action, in contrast to virtue in passivity. So in this picture of benevolence, the value of individualism and the efficiency of divine superiority are only to be predicated from one's indulgence in or a denial of the virtuous weight of ethical action that revolves around the notion of an energaic activity whose summum bonum is human happiness and well-being. So, signaling at the establishment of a new ethical theory, the eudaimonian approach of Shaftesbury's dispels the strict orthodoxy of the church and the egoistic philosophy of Hobbes, but also anachronistically speaking and contrary to critical interpretations of his thought. It also, I would like to contend, it also immediately yields a recurring distinction between ethics and morality that profoundly stresses the disparity between the Aristotelian heritage, where ethics is characterized by its teleological perspective, and a Kantian heritage, where morality is defined by the obligation to respect the norm. So under these terms, Shaftesbury's soliloquy becomes an ethical ergon, a teleological activity which by nature allows the actualization of a virtuous disposition. To put it more correctly, soliloquy emerges as a rational reflection on the self's ethical aim, only through which virtue becomes attainable as distinct from Christian moral identity. So it emerges as a dynamic method of self-inquiry which supports a person's claim to well-being and a good life. And one's indulgence in soliloquizing becomes a marker of one's recognizing that their good itself consists in virtuous activity, and that will eventually contribute to individual happiness, or better put, individual well-being. And in accordance, it becomes unavoidably apparent that his largely subjectivist ethics, which pertains to his conception of soliloquy, fuels a novel understanding of the self. In this context, his influence on the English sentimental novel is one which purports a growing tradition of commentary that is centered around questions of personal identity as well. Because although John Ricchetti argues that the sentimental novel offers a controlling evasion or consoling moral gesture that stands in place of analytical understanding or a systemic criticism, by revealing a confusion in its approach to social problems, I'd like to argue that Shaftesbury's conception of the self as a soliloquy, or better put, his inquisitive method of selfhood, informs the innovative ethical method of the English sentimental novel, as opposed to the morality-based evaluation of human affairs. So an illustrious example of this ethical act is to be found in Tristram Shandy, where the text seemingly promises to narrate the conditions surrounding Tristram's conception, his father's obsession with epistemic precision, his uncle's obsolete relationship with military fortifications, and Tristram's sudden travel to France, and again his uncle's obscure relationship with a certain widow Rodman. For rhetorically speaking, not only does the narrative technique of the novel trespass the boundaries of formal consistency, but also the narrator, in Wayne Booth's words, emerges as the central subject holding together materials, which, were it not for his scatterbrained presence, would never have seemed to be separated in the first place. So in this sense, in a text that is designated as a gargantuan extremity, the entire point of Tristram's presence is not to enforce a narrative reduction to absurdity, that is one major tendency in preceding fiction, but instead to promote a first-person centrality which over and over again accentuates the vitality of individual commentary in novelistic discourse. So, because Tristram's self-consciousness tells another story about selfhood, one that fulfills a role other than a certain subservience to the metafictional and only seemingly chaotic scheme of the narrative. And in this sense, a personal approach of this sort allows us the very conclusion that Tristram's prominent invocation to the reader encapsulates in itself a mock theatricality, a rhetorical hoax that is actually being played upon the reader. So the inner monologue's theatrical value, which creates the firm contract between the narrator and his audience, is substituted with this very concept of Shakespearean soliloquy. And by way of forsaking this textual contract, this specific act of soliloquizing leans towards the Montaignesque tradition of self-commentary, only to point the reader towards the Shakespearean direction of an ethical self-evaluation. So, for instance, at an instance where Tristram evaluates on his father, Walter Shandy's uneasiness about the squeaky door hinges, he construes inconsistent soul that man is, languishing under wounds, which he has the power to heal, his whole life a contradiction to his knowledge, his reason, that precious gift from God to him, instead of pouring in oil, serving but to sharpen his sensibilities, to multiply his pains, and render him more melancholy and uneasy under them. So poor unhappy creature, that he should do so, are not the necessary causes of misery in this life enough, but he must add voluntary ones to his stock of sorrow, struggle against evils which cannot be avoided, and submit to others, which a 10th part of the trouble they create him would remove from his heart forever. So is Tristram speaking here to his audience, or is he indulging himself in a soliloquy? Well, the textual convention of the novel produces the very idea that he could be potentially speaking out loud to his audience, but on the other hand, this particular scene strikes us as a very private moment, and the filial affection that he displays towards his father establishes a brilliant mix of feelings, a mix of compassion and also filial regret. And in that sense, he's privately contemplating on his father's forlornness, since he knows that his father will never be able to recover from his moral astigmatism without even knowing it. And by pointing towards his father's inconsistency, it's very interesting that he actually comments on himself as the squeaky door hinge. And by doing so, Tristram brings the frequent invocation to his reader to a halt during this very private moment he has with himself. And for Walter Shandy's mechanistic struggle coincides with Tristram's difficulty in maintaining a proper narration. So in that sense, by reflecting on his struggle, Tristram comments on his personal struggle as a son, a writer, and an individual being, but he clearly accentuates the points of departure between his own personal struggle and his father's. So after all, the new sentimental ethics of Tristram is all about self-contemplation and eudaimonic compassion, whereas his father continuously ascribes himself to an older mode of Newtonian morality, which barely includes either self-discussion or virtuosity, but simply endorses rule-boundedness and cosmic utility. So in the end, the novel produces a sufficient enough answer to Mrs. Shandy's question with regards to the aim of this book, as it brings to view an inorganic worldview characterized by the individual's need for self-contemplation. So, I mean, the Shandian conception of selfhood through the use of the Shakespearean soliloquy finds itself a kindred soul in Henry Brooks' Full of Quality, And Henry, the second son of the Earl of Morland, who is banished from his home due to his comparative lack of intelligence, is later united with his uncle, who is also a banished family member, and eventually he becomes Henry's mentor in matters of virtue and generosity. Thus, Henry is molded into a virtuous model to be constantly looked up to due to his charity work and compassion for the others. So in a manner of speaking, he becomes the genteel personality he is destined to become, because Richard, his elder brother, is not permitted to breathe the rudeness of the wind. But, Henry has this a feature and, every member as well as feature exposed to all weathers, and is daily occupied in playing and wrestling with the pigs and 2 mongrel spaniels on the common, or in kissing, scratching or boxing with the children of the village. So Henry's bucolic self is an early marker of his egalitarian tendencies, which allows him to be in synonymy not only with nature, but also with other individuals. So, but this egalitarianism, the novel furthers, is the outcome of a charter of virtue, which needs to be obviously tended to carefully at the hands of his uncle, Mr. Fenton, and Mr. Meekley, a clergyman. And eventually Henry's virtue is rewarded by winning the hand of a noblewoman in marriage, ending the novel on a high note. So in this sense, the novel's virtuous agenda seems to offer a communal effort, idealizing benevolence as a class privilege, the moral equivalent for the ruling classes of physical games designed to teach teamwork and to build character. So in doing so, the novel largely furthers an oratorial project preaching Christian charity, and it shies away from instrumentalizing traditional soliloquies, where a Henry instead fully indulges himself in moments of self-inquiry. And in one of his protestations against his uncle, he shares with the reader a moment of self-contemplation where he considers himself a fool, although he happens to be an aristocratic child. And he says, I am but a fool and novice in such matters, but if any other man breathing had given me such a description, I should, from all my little reading, have withstood him to the face. Say then, my dearest father, tell me whence comes this worse than flinty, this cruel-heartedness in man? Why are they not happy in communicating happiness? If my eyes did not see it in a fact, as well as in history, I should think it impossible that anyone should derive pleasure from giving pain to another. So can it be more blessed to destroy than to preserve, to afflict than to gladden, to wound than to heal? My heart wrings regret for being cast into a world where nation against nation, family against family, and man against man are perpetually embattled, grudging, coveting, grasping, tearing every enjoyment, every property, and life itself from each other. So Henry addresses his uncle and his benefactor, Mr. Fenton, with the hope of seeking some advice, obviously, but the entire shape of his discourse presents an already inquisitive mind, an ethical subject that constantly humbles himself, much against the expectations of the aristocratic society of the 18th century. And by constantly throwing out rhetorical questions to his uncle and the reader, he already displays the degree to which he indulges himself in this Shakespearean self-contemplation. So he exceeds the intentions of the author even, and because he becomes an ethical inquirer in his own right, and he is working against the mercantilist and communal background of the novel. And throughout the novel, Henry's foolishness allows him to separate himself into two and inquire into the tidings of the world, of this particular world, to be exact. And that largely disallows a flourishing culture of virtue and happiness. But paradoxically enough, his rhetorical articulateness signals that he has become more than a moral subject, an independent explorer, an ethical individual, and an ardent advocate of a culture of virtue and happiness, of which he is the prime example. So I'm just coming close to the end as another and final point of reference. Henry Mackenzie's spent Man of Feeling, which represents a climactic point in English sentimental novel, narrates the adventures of Harley, an impoverished aristocrat, and the Man of Feeling. So he is shown to embark on a journey to London to complete a money transaction, and Harley encounters various types such as beggars, prostitutes, and misanthropes, as well as old acquaintances of his on his way back to his rural estate. But mysteriously enough, the novel ends on a very low note when Harley unexpectedly falls seriously seriously ill, and he is mourned by the narrator. But the entire action of the novel revolves primarily around his encounters with people from nearly all disadvantaged walks of life, and in his sympathy for those people, he becomes something of an anachronism who usually can do little to prevent or redress the wrongs he observes. Yeah, and yet, however helpless and powerless he might seem, the soliloquy-like instances again give away the Shaftesburyan principle in him. And at one particular instance, he returns to his estate. His exchange with a certain Mr. Edwards almost has a flavour of a soliloquy when he fiercely opposes colonial misrule, referring to the relations between the conqueror and the conquered. And he says, I have a proper regard for the prosperity of my country. I cannot throw off, however, the man so much as to rejoice at our conquests in India. And he also argues, could you tell me of some conqueror given peace and happiness to the conquered? Did he use his power to gain security and freedom to the regions of oppression and slavery? Did he endear the British name by examples of generosity, which the most barbarous or most depraved are rarely able to resist? These were laurels which princes might envy, which an honest man would not condemn. So there is this, obviously, the eudaimonian pattern of his contemplation explicitly crying out the very fact that virtue has become an empty signifier. So, but however, Harley's take on the subject discloses a unique exploration of personal identity where progressivism and 18th century consumerism is strangled to death at the hands of a virtuous, or even better, self-contemplative individual. So the text dazzles us and even raises a certain suspicion about the sentimentalism of the man of feeling. At Harley's hands, sentimentality turns out to be synonymous with rationation, with the simple exception that it is forced to create a particular space for virtuous activity. And so in that sense, in Man of Feeling, we witness the apparent refusal to side with the realist claim that this is how things are, and instead the novel puts to us that this is how to derive a certain aesthetic pleasure from the experience of sympathy. But Mackenzie also refuses to reduce the readerly experience of sympathy to the level of an outlandish display of emotions. In fashioning Harley's self as a soliloquy, he wishes to disband an obligatory form of morality and look into a possible marriage between reason and human happiness, logicism and virtuous wisdom. So his emphasis is on individual well-being, simply takes on the violent commercialism of his contemporary society, constantly accusing it of obliviousness. So these methods of construction of self in these three sentimental novels bring to view authentic takes on self-development, and although their tone and mood tend to vary from each other, they are unified in their emphatic remark on the centrality of the human self and its virtuous development through self-inspection. So in that sense, soliloquy is part of the sentimentalist agenda, which aims primarily at cultivating this well-being. It becomes a means of personal exercise in philosophical inquiry, which aims primarily at the cultivation of virtuous activity. So the underlying motive is decisively Shaftesburyan, but also it necessarily relates itself to the cultivation of human capabilities in the sense Martha Nussbaum speaks of it. So she delineates in her creating capabilities. Capabilities belong first and foremost to individual persons and only derivatively to groups. The approach espouses a principle of each person as an end, and it stipulates that the goal is to produce capabilities for each and every person and not to use some people as a means to the capabilities of others or of the whole. So this neo-Aristotelian charter beautifully fits into the sentimental and eudaimonian approach of Shaftesbury, and her novel programme does not necessarily emerge as a manifestation of human rights, but has a close kinship with it, because the anti-Cartesian instinct in her capitalism refuses to devalue emotions and the imaginative aspect of human nature as innate opposites of human intellectuality. And it tells us the extent to which she sees the inclusion of emotions, human dignity, and the enablement of practical reason into the public sphere, or better put, the public imagination as of perennial importance to flourish this personal identity. So we viewed within this context, obviously her capitalism emerges as a direct descendant of Shaftesburyan ethics, but also it offers a rereading of sentimentalism as a discursive space for human development. So this is also a philosophical stance which goes against the traditional exclusion of sentimentality in the analytical tradition of philosophy and literary criticism, because it has been neglected as, and it is a common practice among philosophers of art and literary critics to condemn sentimental literature, since it is believed that it portrays a false view of the world, it distorts our thinking and substitutes a saccharine portrait of the world for what we all know to be the horrible realities. So they believe that sentimental literature is morally blameworthy and also weak in social commentary, since it is uninformative. And but I certainly do not wish to sound apologetic or offensive here, but simply want to state that these philosophers and critics who devote so much time and energy to defending the so-called rational powers of human cognition potentially miss the point that sentimentality and the sentimental literature hides in itself a rather enlivening perspective on the human self, so much so that the form and content of the English sentimental novel aspire to the condition of an ethical treatise, which not only differentiates itself from the moralistic concerns of Hobbes and Mandeville's naturalism, but also from the casuistic fiction of early English novel. So finally, in offering the non-casuistry and self-inquisitiveness of sentimentality as a therapeutic discursive attitude, it wishes to overcome the lopsided didacticism of early English novel. In the end, the sentimental novel not only acknowledges the supremacy of individual well-being, but also functions as a harbinger of ethical hope in a world which passionately advocates a utilitarian approach to human happiness from the 18th century and beyond. Thank you very much, and sorry for the long presentation.
That was a very enjoyable presentation, Doctor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Again, if anyone has any comments to make or questions to ask, please feel free to do so.
Okay.
Hocam.
I would like to ask Dr. Erksan about Stoic philosophy. Part of your presentation is about Nussbaum's ideas about human flourishing, human development, and well, she is a contemporary proponent of Stoic philosophy, and I wonder if and Stoic philosophy is, you know, at the center of the Stoic philosophy. There is this human flourishing, and the central tenet is like a life worth living, eudaimonia, something like that. There is this Greek word for it. I can't right now, but so this life worth living, this central tenet of Stoic philosophy. Do we find any traces of it, a Stoic discourse in the 18th century sentimental discourse of 18th century novels? In fact, do we find any Stoic ideas, any supportive Stoic philosophy, any mention of Stoic philosophy? And I mean,
yes, we do. Yes, we do. Thank you very much for the question. Yes, we do, and in that particular sense, it is very relevant. In the context of 18th century English sentimental novel, because it was a time when these Stoics were actually were being translated at a great level, I could say, and in that sense, in Tristram Shandy, for example, there are lots of references, scattered references, but still we do have references to Epicurus, and in that sense, the Stoic influence is already there, and I guess one of its contributions to the sentimental novel is it shows how fragile actually human beings are, and yet, because I mean, if the contention is obviously that if human happiness is meant to depend on external goods, it's not really going anywhere. But I mean, if we can obviously cultivate this culture of virtue, perhaps we may, hope to live in peace with ourselves and also with society, I guess. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, sure, it does. Stoic philosophy, this focus on human flourishing and virtue. It's about this, it is centralized on this idea of reaching out to others. In other words, the morality, the moral development of human being, and it involves primarily a recognition of others, a respect for others, and reaching out to others. And I wonder if it is compatible with all the self-centered kind of sentimental discourse of 18th century works in a way. This reaching out to others, you know, the recognition of the others, and, you know.
Yes, I mean, I totally understand. I mean, because I have already referred to that, and I referred to it for this particular reason, because the self-centeredness obviously can be, you know, mistaken for a certain version of egoism in that sense, but it's like it doesn't make necessarily or produce necessarily a commentary on egoism in that sense, because you know, critics, especially contemporary critics of Shaftesbury's thought and in relation to Stoic philosophy, they believe that this is no self-centeredness. Actually, this is just you know, creating or refashioning yourself as a human being or an individual, and then giving out in the Stoic sense to the others. So basically, yes, it is definitely compatible with the sentimental discourse, because the sentimental discourse is all about making a contribution to this particular point about caring, not primarily about yourself, but giving out to the others. But the very sentimental figure can only give out to the others if he or she is able to sort of indulge himself or herself in virtuous action, I would say.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. ÖZBAŞ.
Thank you.
Do we have any other comments or questions? If not, we can move along with the presentations. I suppose we can. Okay, so the next presentation will be by Dr. İpek YİİT from Istanbul Kültür University. She received her PhD from the Department of English Language and Literature at Boğaziçi University, and her dissertation is on how intersections of religion and social class are represented in the Victorian novels of the 1850s. Her research interests include 19th century fiction, novel theory, women's writing, and theology in the Victorian novel. Her most recent publication is a research article titled Unitarianism and Social Reconciliation in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South in Ideas, Journal of English Literary Studies, and she currently works as a lecturer at the Department of English Language and Literature at Istanbul University. Dr. KOTAN YİİT, you have the floor.
Thank you, Furkan, for the introduction. I hope all of you can hear my voice all right.
Yes, we can.
Apologies about the cough. I still have the after effects of a long bout of the flu. So without much further ado, I'm going to dive into my presentation. So today I will be talking to you about Sonia Linden's play. I have before me a remarkable document given to me by a young lady from Rwanda, which I'm going to refer to as I have before me from now on, because, you know, it's such a long title. So this is a play that was written and performed in the early 2000s, and it's about this young girl from Rwanda named Juliet, who comes to England as a refugee, and she is also a genocide survivor. So in England, at the refugee center, she is paired with a writing instructor / poet named Simon, and under his guidance, she transforms the book, which she had been writing about Rwanda, from a more or less objective, informative kind of text to a personal record of her own experiences and traumas. And this shift into the subjective is celebrated on the level of narrative as a success, as if she's finally on the way to become free of her past and heal and so on. So I'm going to argue that this model, this understanding of performative trauma is a very Western or Eurocentric and relatively recent practice, which is nevertheless assumed to be universal and all-effective. So I think Sonia Linden's play is a particularly useful artifact through which to explore this model because it straddles a particular line. So on the one hand, it genuinely believes in this process and its efficiency, and on the other hand, its sharp focus on the process by which the trauma narrative is manufactured problematizes this givenness, this naturalness of the model. So because of this ambiguity, I use Linden's play I have before me to discuss this idea of trauma narrative as a manufactured performance. So of course, there is also the fact that it's a play, so it's literally meant to be performed. And now, very briefly, for some theoretical framework, in human rights literature, as well as in the wider culture, trauma and traumatic remembering has become an increasingly popular and widespread concept to understand and give meaning to the human experience. Especially in popular culture and social media in the last 5 to 10 years, a very streamlined, simplified kind of therapy speak has prevailed, and trauma is also part of this discourse. But of course, it's not just that. So the popularization of this concept, trauma, or arguably goes back as far as the middle of the 20th century to the Holocaust and to the stories surrounding the Holocaust. Like when I say stories, I mean testimonials from people who actually experienced it, perhaps also later fictionalizations, as well as memoirs, but in a more immediate sense too, the trials which followed on World War II. So this interconnection between trauma, storytelling, and genocide at the point of genesis is particularly useful to me and illustrative, as will become clear in a minute. But I think one of the main ideas here is that there is this unspeakable event, experience, and so on, which is then made somehow utterable, speakable through the vocabulary and tropes of the literature of trauma. So it's rendered as this interiorized sort of psychic pain and damage, which might be exorcised by telling it, by speaking it out. So I'm speaking obviously in very broad strokes, but this is the idea. In Human Rights and Narrative Lives, the Ethics of Recognition, Kay Schaffer and Sidney Smith make the following 2 observations in addition to this premise. And I think they map on so neatly onto my reading of Sonia Linden's play I have before me. So the first idea is that there is this gap between the event of the Holocaust and its institutionalization, which attests to the idea that this is a construction rather than a universal or a given. So they say, I'm quoting, personal memories of the Nazi genocide became part of a public discourse beyond the personal, resonating within world cultural memory. This transformation was aided by the proliferation of published life narratives, films, and the immensely popular television miniseries. Holocaust broadcast in the United States and subsequently in Europe. Over the next decade, at academic conferences and in university courses, scholars and students debated the ethics, politics, and aesthetics of Holocaust representation with reference to the growing body of Holocaust narratives. So this was the case with regard to the Holocaust. Of course, this gap, this transformation would be much more seamless in the case of the Rwandan genocide and its aftermath, because this narrative is already there in place to be used. The other idea from Schaffer and Smith is a criticism, and it's this idea that trauma is not necessarily the universal value or concept which we tend to think it is. And I am quoting from the text again. They say, recently, however, the universal applicability of a psychoanalytic model with its emphasis on the closed interiority of trauma has been contested as inadequate to address the diverse experiential histories, languages of suffering, structures of feeling, and storytelling modes, evidenced in diverse cultural traditions around the world. So critics argue that the psychoanalytic model privileges stories suffused with traumatic remembering and suffering and silences other kinds of stories that may not unfold through the Western trope of trauma. They argue that it universalizes diverse and multiple structures of feeling, eliding gender, racial, and ethnic differences. It renders individual suffering and psychic interiority the ground of trauma, making it difficult to register the cultural transmission of stories and their implication in institutional and political structures and practices. So I know, very long sentence, but it's very germane to my argument. I think that this criticism goes to the heart of the element which I problematize in the play I have before me, that asking for conformity to this model of traumatic storytelling may be an act of goodwill, but it forces certain Western-centric ideas and values onto people who might not necessarily have them. So moving on to the play, in I Have Before Me, it is this particular understanding and practice of trauma and healing that is being highlighted and foregrounded through the encounters between Juliet, who, as I said, is a refugee from Rwanda in London, and Simon, her British writing mentor and a poet. I would argue that even though there is a challenge, the resolution of the play restores the status quo rather than dismantling it by having Juliet read out a page from her memoir to the audience and positing it as a crucial moment in her healing process. There are, however, moments of tension and failures in communication throughout the play that rise out of the two characters, that is Juliet and Simon's, different understandings of what writing and healing should be like. And these moments of tension exemplify the possibility that the understanding of trauma and its healing that currently prevails is the result of cultural conditioning rather than an essential feature of trauma itself. At the beginning of the play, we find Juliet, prior to her first meeting with Simon, worrying about the impression she and her manuscript will make. So she thinks to herself, oh, he must be so educated, thinking of Simon. His English will be perfect, perfect grammar, perfect spelling. I don't mind how strict he is. I need to learn. This is an opportunity for me. When he sees my book, he will see how serious I am. So this is an indicator of the disjunction that will prevail over their communication for quite some time. Because Juliet has a different idea, not just what a writer should like, and she is disappointed when she sees Simon looking less than impeccable, but also of what good writing should be like. So, oh, it's so beautiful, she says to herself, looking at her manuscript. It's typed like a proper book. All the pages are so clean. I hope it is a good translation. However, the things which she pays attention to are not the things that Simon or other prospective readers are going to pay attention to, and this is just a foretaste of that. So at their next meeting, the difference becomes even more pronounced and obvious when Simon tells her, you've packed in a lot here, the historical background, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. I can see you worked really hard. So to Juliet, the implicit criticism in this comment and the following exchange is not very obvious. She thinks this is a compliment to how hardworking and thorough she is. And then Simon goes on to inform her that good writing makes you see what the writer wants you to see and feel, of course. Writing is about feeling, Juliet. So when Simon is talking about what writing is about, of course, he has a particular kind of writing in mind, which is supposed to be a testimonial narrative of Juliet's suffering/trauma and the appropriate expected form it should take for it to be ready for consumption. So this advice about good writing and Simon's further attempts to reorient Juliet's writing accordingly are ultimately not about Juliet, I would argue, and her story, but about making it fit in a certain framework within which it can be intelligible and accessible to a reading public. So later on, when Juliet begins to include personal details in her account, such as her siblings chasing each other with lizards, Simon is overjoyed. He tells Juliet that it's these sort of wonderful details we want to get in your book, and you must write about your grandparents too. So in this way, Simon is asking Juliet to translate her experience and suffering to a recognized currency. And despite his cultural sensitivity, he initially cannot see why this might be a problem for Juliet. So Juliet finally snaps and says to him, Simon, you don't understand. I need to start my life. I need to live now. But every time I write, I'm there. When Juliet says this to him, he doesn't directly respond to her predicament, but simply tells her that her book is too important to be put away. Similarly, when Juliet tells him that people are important, he answers by saying that she made them come alive through her writing. So it's as if writing is this fetishized object for Simon, and the audience he represents, true and only true, which sense can be made of Juliet. And I think it's not coincidental either that Juliet's final conversion to the belief in the ways of the personal narrative happens as she is on a trip to Uganda to see her estranged brother. So it's as if going there from London with the knowledge that she will be back in London again, she herself starts to think like Simon does. Now I want to finish my book very soon, and when I come back to London, I will try to finish it with your help, she writes him. And the final speech she gives to a Western audience in London is a testament to the change that she has undergone. She informs them that she has written this book to help hopeless people all over the world, and that in writing it, she has cured herself, literally, of her migraines, and also found what the meaning of life is. And I'm quoting more or less verbatim from the text. Finally, as claimed by Smith and Schaffer, whom I referred to earlier, this therapeutical understanding of trauma and healing has been transmitted to her, to Juliet, via Simon, and she has appropriated this method, arguably, because it's the most dominantly valid one in the sphere, the world she wants to inhabit. As such, the ending of the play is a restoration of order. But throughout the play, I would argue that Juliet does and says plenty of things to challenge this understanding. All right, so thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope it's made sense to you. I hope you got some use out of it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. KOTAN YİİT. Again, if you have any comments or questions from the audience, please feel free to do so. All right, then. So our next presenter is Professor Dr. Vesna SULJIĆ from International University of Sarajevo. She's an assistant professor and head of cultural studies and also English language and literature program coordinator at International University of Sarajevo, Bosnia and Herzegovina. She has an extensive teaching experience at both undergraduate and graduate university levels. She has taught English as a foreign language, as well as a range of courses in literature. She has also been a practicing translator and interpreter in Bosnian and English languages. She is interested in literature and creative writing. She published articles in a number of journals and translated several books. Her latest publication is Creative Writing, Experimental and Experiential Reflective Practice book, published in 2022. She is interested in sharing her knowledge and experiences with students and academicians on various issues, including equal opportunities, human rights, and freedom of expression. And her, the title of her presentation is Interpretations of Human Rights, Law, and Justice in Literary Works written by Female Aboriginal Authors. Professor SULJIČ, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I've also prepared a slide presentation, so can you give me access to it?
I think you have host privileges right now.
Let me check. I got it. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Okay. I go to share screen.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. When I go to share screen, window, to screen. When I go to entire screen, okay, it does.
Yeah, we can see it now.
Okay, let me just close this. I've got lots of screens here. Okay. Okay, fine. All right, can I start now?
Yes,
you can
please.
See. Okay.
Yes,
so,
we can see the presentation all right.
Okay, thank you very much. So, history of Indigenous peoples in Australia has been continuous for tens of thousands of years. Some say they've been in Australia for the last 60,000 years. But the knowledge about the culture or cultures, beliefs and laws is still being searched for, and it's still being discovered and interpreted. Now, after having been brought almost to the edge of extinction 100 years ago, due to different policies after the colonization of Australia, thanks to some changes in official policies that grant equal status and opportunities to all Australian citizens, and also due to numerous human rights activists, authors, artists, and other public persona who raised this public awareness of the mistreatment of Aboriginal population in the past, and also of the abuse of human rights, law and justice in relation to the Aboriginal Australians, their numbers are slightly rising nowadays. So in my presentation today, I would like to contribute to better understanding of the modern day Aboriginal culture and its connection with the past, and to present works created by 4 authors of Aboriginal descent, or who are, okay, I'm trying to go to another slide.
Yeah, we can see the one you click on.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. The computer is probably slow, that's why. Okay, so I would like to present these 4 authors of, as I said, of Aboriginal descent, or who have some familiar connections with Aboriginal people, and to acknowledge their contribution in understanding the differences of interpretation of human rights and justice between the Western culture and the culture or the cultures of the others. Now, the others in inverted commas. So I have selected these 4 female authors, namely Kath Walker, that was previously referred to by Professor Pema Eden-Sander in her introduction to this conference. Also, Sally Morgan, Ross Moriarty, and finally, Auntie Rhonda Collar-Spratt. Now, I have selected them because their literary output spans the period of more than 50 years, and also through seemingly different in their narrative styles and literary genres, starting from autobiography by Sally Morgan to diary-like memories by Ross Moriarty, also poetry by Kath Walker or Auntie Rhonda Collar-Spratt, to pamphlets and other pieces that they wrote. Their message is similar in many ways. So they question, who is the other? Is the other me, who knows something about you, or is the other you, who knows very little about me? So basically, this is what I'm going to focus on today, and through sharing their philosophy, experiences, and goodwill, these 4 authors stand for human rights and justice that is not discriminatory but fair to all. So let me first introduce some characteristics of traditional Aboriginal beliefs and practices in relation to what we consider human rights. Okay, I'm hoping my slide will come up. So traditional Aboriginal society was egalitarian. That means there were no major distinction between genders like male, female duties, obligations, but they had like similar or equal rights towards life and resources. Why? Because people did not possess anything that they could not share with others. So anything a person had to be shared, okay? And also, if a person died, anything the person had during his or her lifetime would be destroyed after the person's death. So there were no rulers, kings, chiefs, etc. And decisions were made based on the common consent of the whole tribe. However, in this context, women had less influence in decision-making process, but also they would be regarded equal because they would be responsible for teaching about and application of some particular customs or rules. And my computer is still lazy. I'm sorry, let me try. So, according to our Western understanding of law, law is based on written rules, on regulations, definitions, and punishments. That kind of law did not exist in the pre-colonization period in the Aboriginal communities. Aboriginal law and practices were believed to derive from the dreaming, and as such, they could not be changed or amended or cancelled or nullified. So law of the dreaming was passed through stories which were sung or performed during rituals or dance ceremonies. Sacred places were visited, and even at great distances, and members of the tribe would meet at those dance ceremonies. They are called corroborees, and they would ensure that everybody who attends the ceremony learns about the country, about the relationship between different tribes, the moral code, and the law. In respect of egalitarianism, some rituals were men only, some were women only, and some combined both genders, and also there were some rituals that combined both adults and children. Now, although these were gender-based distinctions, the rituals did not have any hierarchical exclusivity or gender-based superiority. This is what I mean when I say they were egalitarian. On the contrary, Aboriginal people believed that men are responsible for some and women for some other things, and that their different roles stem from the same dreaming law, which could not be questioned nor forfeited. Therefore, they shared the knowledge that they accumulated through life and also through generations before them, and they were passing this knowledge through songs and stories. Now, one important thing to mention is that on this vast continent, there were hundreds of tribes, and very interestingly, these tribes did not share the common language, and especially tribes from the neighboring tribes, they could not communicate because the differences between the languages were much bigger than, for example, in Europe between, I don't know, French and English or English and German. However, it was the women who would act as cultural mediators, and they had bilingual or bicultural, let's say, capacities, because a woman would be raised in one tribe, speaking one language, but when she, let's say, got married or united with a man from another tribe, she would go to another tribe and then she would carry her own language and she would learn the language of another tribe. And some women managed to learn more than one language, especially as Rosna Rati mentions in her book, Listening to Country. Her husband's mother took with her fluency in 8 Aboriginal languages. That was quite rare. Now, the dreaming law is actually what connected these people, and that's why I said it's significant, because they didn't speak the same language, but they had the same or similar beliefs that were passed on from one generation to generation. And the dreaming law is that the Aboriginal sense of belonging relates to being one with nature, and because this dimension is timeless and spaceless. And this is what unified different communities across this land, despite the language barriers. Now, I would like to continue. I'm sorry, this presentation doesn't seem to be working. Can you see something now?
Yes, we can. We can see Kath Walker.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so something's going wrong, but okay. So Kath Walker was born as Kathleen Jean Mary Ruska on an island in Queensland, and that was the home of Nunukul tribe. She was an Aboriginal, and she became a prominent and persuasive figure who provided a very brave new voice to marginalised Aboriginal Australians, and also she promoted Aboriginal rights across Australia and the world. In 1964, she published her first book of poetry titled We Are Going, which was the first book of poetry written by an Aboriginal. In 1966, she published another one, The Dawn is at Hand, and in the same period, she became a very strong activist and a member of the Queensland Aboriginal Advancement League. Her activism extended from political speeches to lobbying for important reforms and issues like mining, conservation, and also to lecturing at universities and colleges around Australia. She presented and lectured about Australian arts and culture, and from 1970s she participated in the international symposia, conferences and other important events where she brought attention of the overseas people to the Aboriginal matters. She continued writing poetry, so in 1970 she published a collection titled My People. It's an anthology that saw its 5th edition in 2021. This is the edition that I have at home. It celebrates 50 years of the first publication. And besides writing, she was also an artist, and she illustrated her books and published a volume of her paintings. And with her son, Kabul, she was also a scriptwriter and producer of a Dreamtime story, The Rainbow Serpent. That was the feature of the Australian Pavilion at World Expo 88. Now, after federal government refused to enact national land rights legislation, as it had been previously promised, Kath Walker wanted to emphasize her Aboriginal identity and also the customary laws that were associated with the land. So she announced her change of name, and she took the Aboriginal name Udjuru of the tribe Nunukul, and she is referred to as custodian of the land Midjariba. Now, during her lifetime, Udjuru received many awards for the literary work and also for her political activism, including the Aboriginal of the Year Award in 1985, an award of an honorary Doctor of Letters from Macquarie University from Melbourne in 1988, and also from Griffith University in 1989. Udjuru passed away in 1993, but her legacy continues in bringing her humanistic and traditional Aboriginal views out, and as she states in her poem, The Past, The poem title is The Past. She says, past is all about us and within. Now I'm going to continue with her, with her poetry. Okay, you can see it. So her poetry includes her political activism and also comes from the outsider within experiences. So she is aware of the discrimination which she experienced herself, but she also is a dreamer, and she wants to give hand in the process of reconciliation, of a mutual agreement and understanding the differences that should not necessarily divide people, but that could also make people closer. So she addresses wide audiences and she promotes equal rights to all according to legacies of the dreaming. So it is clearly expressed in poems like this one called All One Race, where she wonders, black tribe, yellow tribe, red, white, brown, from where the sun jumps up to where it goes down. Hers and Puka Sahib's, demoiselles and squaws, all one family, so why make wars? So showing that differences in color or belonging to a tribe or culture or custom or any other denominator of difference should not be predominant when considering human race, she concludes, I'm for humankind, not color tribes. I'm international and never mind tribes. And the same attitude is conveyed in the second stanza of the poem with a very strong message to us all. I'm international, never mind place. I'm for humanity, all one race. Now, for someone who comes from the culture that considers living beings strongly and firmly connected to the land they come from, who see the land as continuation of their spiritual and bodily connections with their ancestral beings, it is praiseworthy that she asserts that she does not mind place, that she considers herself international, which means above limitations of power-made policies, subordination, governments, or any other factors that set boundaries to human rights or freedom or justice. Okay, my next slide is about, So Ojuru was also advocating for justice and equal rights to all. However, being an Aboriginal, she is proud of her Aboriginality, and her focus is to ascertain that the rights of the Aboriginal population are to be fulfilled. So her poem, Aboriginal Charter of Rights, was presented in 1962 at a government meeting. It was actually prepared to address participants of the 5th Annual General Meeting of the Federal Council for the Advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It's a very long title, so I had to read it completely. This Charter of Rights, despite being overly political and direct, this poem is at the same time very powerful and very poetic. And it's also worth mentioning that it is a predecessor to Martin Luther King's 1963 speech, I Have a Dream. Now, she demands that Aborigines are not falsely protected by the government policies and decrees, but that they should have opportunity that places white and black on equal basis. Now, remember, this is 1962, when the Aboriginal population didn't have citizenship rights, so they didn't have like status in Australia. So Ujuru, very fearless and very eloquent in the same style, continues, give us welcome, not aversion. Give us choice, not cold coercion. Status, not discrimination. Human rights, not segregation. So I think it's really, really powerful and inspiring. So she would like Aboriginal people to keep their customs, songs, dances, corroborees. However, she also votes for integration and coexistence based on the principles of equality equality and justice. And she proudly states that in her poem, Integration, yes, and this is a short excerpt, no, not assimilation, but integration. Not submergence, but our uplifting, so black and white may go forward together in harmony and brotherhood. So, Ujuru is not only addressing the Aboriginal population, but she also analyzes white Australians, and she scrutinizes their attitudes, and she makes passionate, sometimes provocative pleas for justice and for changes on both sides. She shows willingness to accept that a change is needed in order to continue coexistence with the new occupants of their traditional land, and that is apparent in the poem, Let Us Not Be Bitter. So Ujuru asserts that the Aboriginal people should go onward and away with bitterness and the bitter past. She hopes that the future will bring fulfillment and progress in life for all. So Ujuru's wishful thinking from the mid-1960s did come true, as some of the most distinguished artists, authors, or entrepreneurs are Aboriginal, and they have a very important position in the Australian society nowadays. For example, Charles Perkins, Sally Morgan, the author, Cathy Freeman, sportsperson, John Moriarty, one of the people who promoted Aboriginal arts throughout the world on Qantas, airplanes, etc. Now, this short overview of Ujuru's active political and creative life will conclude with a poem that depicts Aboriginal way of life from a different perspective. So in her Ballad of Totems, it's a very, very funny poem, Ujuru presents a strong-headed mother who had it her way against the traditional strong customary law. She comes from another clan and she is supposed to respect her husband's totem. But in this case, the totem is a serpent. It's a serpent snake, which in the woman's opinion is responsible for killing her chickens. Now, after her husband dies, the woman is expected to observe the traditional law and respect her late husband's totem. However, it's suggested in the poem that the woman breached the law in the most punishable sense. What she did, she cooked the snake and served it for lunch to her family one day. However, it could not be proven. And the tone of the poem is very humorous, and also the musicality of the poem, emphasized by the regular meter and rhyme, also suggests that the poem could be sung at women's corroborees. It also suggests that female members of the Aboriginal traditional community had risk-taking attitudes and could make decisions and act independently of the male members of the clan if they found it suitable or necessary. Okay, let me move on to Sally Morgan. She wrote the autobiography called My Place. As I mentioned, the span of their literary output is more than 50 years. So Sally Morgan was born in 1951. She was very well educated. She was a successful student of psychology, which she graduated from the University of Western Australia. Also, she got her postgraduate qualifications in both counselling psychology and computing, and library studies from Western Australia Institute of Technology. And besides writing and being a psychologist, she's also a successful artist, and her works are displayed in major Australian galleries. Now, one issue that is worth mentioning is that since the first day of colonization of Australia, besides obviously striving for the economic profit from the land and the resources, the British implemented a deeply embedded culture of colonization because English language became the official language, the British system of government and education were the norm, and also British sociocultural values were promoted. So all these left the people subjugated, and they had kind of a psychological inheritance of a negative self-image and alienation from their indigenous cultures, which had been devalued or even forbidden. This is why Sally Morgan was not aware of her Aboriginal part of the family tree early in her life. However, she was motivated to learn about her roots and because she was angered by the injustice that she observed in her environment. So she did not speak any Aboriginal languages and she was raised and educated in English only. Even her parents, her mother, made her believe that he was an Indian because she wanted to spare her from being humiliated by her friends or colleagues. However, when she decided to search about her family historical background, she employed the oral history approach and visited local Aboriginal groups. And she wrote a book which was sold in more than 100,000 copies in Australia in that year. Then it was republished and reprinted 28 times. She received several distinguished awards in Australia and worldwide. And one of the reasons why the book gained so much attention was because it was written in English, but the story was relatable to both English and Aboriginal readers. The English ones could learn new things about the people from their neighborhoods, and the Aboriginal ones could also identify themselves with Sally and people from her familiar environment. So Sally Morgan achieved that not only her personal history was heard, but also that her story revealed hidden histories of other oppressed people. And although this autobiographical approach tends to be subjective, Morgan attempted to keep her narrative as objective as possible so that her painful memories did not interfere with facts which mattered to make her story as truthful as possible. Now, critics praised the book as the great source of personal and relatable information about the Indigenous communities who from this project may be encouraged to tell their own stories or read more about others as well. Now, Sally Morgan told her story as an outsider from within society, and she exposed the atrocious consequences of the assimilation policy that was promoted by the Australian government during the period of 1930s to 1970s, during which period the Aboriginal communities lost their language, culture, family connections, and also ultimately that led to their alienation from their Aboriginal society and also caused psychological confusion in relation to their sense of identity, who they were. Furthermore, the discrimination of Aboriginals in public, educational or social spheres added to the growing prejudices of the white population against those who had some kind of trace of Aboriginal blood in their bodies. Now, for example, Morgan comments in this book, in her autobiography, that she received a scholarship based on her Aboriginal roots, but her Aboriginality was regarded with suspicion because she said the department never expected any of their Aboriginal students to do well at tertiary studies, so they didn't expect Aboriginals to be intelligent enough to go to further education. Now, what she succeeded in disclosing in her personal recount of her experiences of Australian assimilation policy is how human rights, law and justice were abused in relation to the Aboriginal population. For example, the official information that she was researching was difficult to gather because during the time she was doing her research, most police and other files dealing with the Aboriginal population were not accessible to public. But like Ujuru, she was brave and outspoken with her autobiography, which empowered other Aboriginal people to share their stories, not only during the corroborees, as they used to do in the ancient times, but also on the live stage or in writing. And by doing so, Sally Morgan followed the traditional law of dreaming, which instructs that it is important to impart knowledge on others. And as she wrote the book in English, her knowledge and experiences could be shared with non-Aboriginal people in Australia and worldwide who may not have had access to the Aboriginal communities. Can I continue? I have about 5 more minutes.
Yes, you may, Vesna.
Okay, thank you. The next is Ross Moriarty, one of my favorite authors. She published the book Listening to Country in 2010. Ross Moriarty is not Aboriginal, or at least she does not identify herself as an Aboriginal, although during her research on her family background, she found some dusky-skinned cousins on her father's side and also some black blood on her mother's side. But she grew up in Tasmania, in the city of Davenport, and she had not known a single Aboriginal person during her growing up. When she went to work after she finished her studies, she went to Canberra where she met her husband, John, and he was an Aboriginal. His father was Irish, but mother was Aboriginal. And John Moriarty was one of the Stolen Generation's children who was taken away from his family at the age of 4. And John reunited with his family and culture during his 30s. So, Ross and John got married, had children, and they frequently went to visit his Aboriginal community at Woolloola in Australian Northern Territory. So this is how Ross Moriarty got in touch with the Australian Aboriginal culture. In 2006, she joined a group of Aboriginal women who were going on their corroboree, this ritual ceremony, in the outback. And in this book, Listening to Country, she recounts that extraordinary journey that she had with a group of 150 Aboriginal women. In this book, she also talks about her husband's family and how they promoted Aboriginal culture throughout the world. In 1983, they started a family design business called Ballaringi, which are Aboriginal design textiles for fashion and furnishing. And also Qantas, the Australian air company, had the Aboriginal design, Wonala Dreaming, which is John's totem, kangaroo, on its fleet. And thanks to that, in 1994, Qantas airplanes were the most photographed aircrafts in the world, which also promoted culture of the Aboriginal communities. So in this book, Moriarty shares the knowledge and awareness of the importance of acknowledging the Aboriginal contribution to continuation of the old traditions in the modern day times. She shares the Aboriginal women's practices in relation to the traditional law and its interpretation in the community. And she says, I'm quoting, "It was the women who showed me the view of the world fundamentally different from any other I knew." So her hope is that in some small way, we could build a bridge for others to enter the magical spirited place that is the culture of Aboriginal Australia, and so open the possibility of more open exchange. It would be a dialogue about community, respectful place, and celebration of the human spirit. So Moriarty thus shares that what is culturally specific to the Aboriginal females and also demonstrates that where there is desire and openness in the heart, boundaries stretch and new horizons widen. So she presents the Australian Aboriginal culture as being the other, but as individuals who are different, but at the same time interesting and unique. Individuals who have been unheard, but who have much to say and share with others. Those who do know what it means to belong, to be one with the country, with ancestors, with the dreaming. Moriarty makes a very strong statement that by exploring Aboriginal spirituality and practices, she was able to embrace both cultures, the Aboriginal as much as her own, and learn from each one. So being different, this is the interpretation of the Australian culture. Being different can enrich individuals and their sense of identity and belonging. So the book Listening to the Country is an objective expression of the willingness to understand and accept cultural differences, which is crucial for fostering good relationships. And the last person in this presentation that I'm going to talk about is Auntie Rhonda Collard-Spratt. She is an Australian Aboriginal, and as you know, as I've mentioned, the beliefs and practices that they share are quite different from the practices that are shared by the institutionalized religions in the Western civilizations, like Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam, etc. So the dreaming has a very inclusive approach that humans and everything around the humans, including living, non-living things, animals, plants, everything, and the world, so the whole world are one. Now, in the Western civilizations, the notion of the land or country is always defined within the territorial, ethnic, or language boundaries. But in Australian Aboriginal culture, the land is the parent of all the creatures residing on it, whether alive or not. And this parent, this world, is giving birth, support, comfort, and meets all the needs of her breed. Now, Aboriginal tribes did not chart the boundaries because it was the land was everyone's, but there was a kind of unwritten law where people could move and which territories can be occupied by which nomadic tribe. Now, when the English sovereignty was declared over Australian land and its inhabitants, the Australian land was chartered and distributed to the new settlers. And the indigenous populations were then turned into kind of subtenants or borders of the land that they inhabited for thousands of years. Now, feeling that loss of connection with the ancestral Mother Earth has affected the Aboriginal peoples immensely. Now, Auntie Rhonda Collard-Spratt is also one of the stolen generation's Aboriginal children. She spent her childhood in the missions, and she speaks of both the sorrow of the mother who lost her child and also of the joy when the child and the mother find each other. Her poem, Lost Mother, that appears in her autobiography, Alice's Daughter, Lost Mission Child, that she wrote in collaboration with Jackie Farrow, and that was published in 2017. She describes the land as her lost mother, who she yearns to know and see. And the land mother gives abundance of her love to the child. And while doing this land mother feels the emptiness that was created in the child, that the child felt worthless. So the land mother encourages the child to feel free and to be aware that the child and the land are one. So as you see at the physical layout of this poem, it looks like a pregnant woman. Now, this Mother Earth and this encouragement also consoles the child, who now feels belonging to the land and to herself. So Auntie Rhonda Collard-Spratt reminds the Aboriginal people that this land is yours as far as the eyes can see. It flows in your blood right down to the sea. So the rain that comes feels like the mother's tears of relief after reconnecting with her lost child as well. So Auntie Rhonda Collard-Spratt is not only talking about colonization and its effects on the Aboriginal people, but she also shares the message that Mother Earth will suffer if her children are not wise. When the land is killed and the crops cannot grow, or when Mother Earth dies, her children will die too. So she speaks about the injustices that both Aboriginal people and the planet Earth have suffered, and her stories and poems promote tolerance and reconciliation. So coming to my last slide. So apart from telling these stories, which show the impact of colonization, cultural misunderstanding and prejudices based on ignorance and prejudices, These 4 female authors whose works I presented today also try to connect their cultural heritage with others who are not familiar with Australian Aboriginal culture and their traditional understanding of human rights and justice. So in their works, they address others, non-Aboriginal ones as well, and they also contribute to sharing knowledge about Australian Aboriginals from their own perspectives. And by doing so, they are demonstrating, as Oodgeroo states in her Aboriginal Charter of Rights, that they are not aliens in their own land. And their achievements in this respect reflect their political consciousness as well. So Sally Morgan, Ross Moriarty, Gath Walker Oodgeroo, and Auntie Rhonda Collier-Spratt do not create this me against you or one against another philosophy, but they embrace the philosophy of inclusion, teaching about the diversity and acceptance of the other as equal, although different. They present what the outsider within knows and feels and how ideas of human rights, justice and law should be interpreted. So it is not surprising that their works bear titles like My People, My Place, Lost Mother, or Listening to Country. So connection with all people, with the planet, with the dream time is what they regard as human, just and right. And I think we could all learn from their lines. So that's the end of my long presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor SULJIĆ, for your presentation. If you have any comments or questions again, we can take them right now. We have kind of used up most of the break that we initially planned for. So unless we have any comments or questions, I'd like to quickly move on to our next presentation.
I only have a comment, not a question.
Oh,
I just want to thank you. It was a very informative presentation and very enjoyable. And I learned a lot from it. Thank you.
Thank you for your feedback. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Dr. PRATIBHA from Bennett University. She is an assistant professor at English and Communication at the School of Management, Bennett University, India. She earned her MPhil and PhD from the Department of English, Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. Her research focuses on Dalit literature in English. She has delivered 20 paper presentations in national as well as international conferences and seminars. And the title of her presentation is Poems for Human Rights, Contemporary Dalit Poetry in English. Dr. PRATIBHA, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for having me here. I would need the rights to share my screen. I have a presentation to show. Thank you very much. Please give me a moment. Is my screen visible to all?
Yes, yes, Doctor.
Just a second. Let's begin the slideshow. So, my presentation today is on Poems for Human Rights, Contemporary Dalit Poetry in English. And the presentation has this flow. I'll begin with an introduction stating the key arguments. Then I'll proceed to give you the context on Dalit literature. And after that, I'll be discussing a few poems on the theme of caste and violence. The next thematic segment would be on English in Dalit context and on the use of language, followed by discussion on transnational solidarities that these poets are trying to cultivate, followed by conclusion. So in this paper, my key arguments are that contemporary Dalit poetry in English challenges the stronghold of elitist Brahminical cultural values in the mainstream post-colonial Indian poetry in English. By decrying the systemic denial of human rights and dignity that the former untouchables suffer under the hegemonic caste system, these poems testify their marginalization and subjugation. contemporary poets such as Chandramohan S., Meena Kandasamy, and Yogesh Maitreya are writing anti-caste poetry to create and sustain imaginative spaces for articulation of anti-caste sensibility. And the English language, which in the post-colonial context has been considered a bastion of caste, class, and colonial hegemony, is now being weaponized by Dalit poets for activism. To give a bit of context, who are Dalits? This word actually comes from the vernaculars Hindi, Bangla, and Marathi, where it means ground down or broken to pieces. However, in English, it is a political term used for socio-political assertion by people who were earlier stigmatized as untouchables under the caste system. Just for the benefit of those who do not know about the caste system or know little about it, this is a status order system in the Hindu societal order, where there are 4 divisions of castes, primarily the Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. These castes are called Savarnas and are located almost on the top of the hierarchy that can be envisioned in a sort of pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid, we have the outcasts who were labeled as untouchables. They are called Avarnas, and they have been variously named as, for instance, the father of our nation, M.K. Gandhi, had called them Harijans. But then in the constitutional parlance, they are called scheduled castes. But Dalit is a name that these people have assumed, have given themselves to assert themselves socio-politically. Now, Dalits are spread all over India and other countries in South Asia, such as Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Myanmar. However, the term was initially coined, the political instance of the term was initially coined by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in 1928 in his writings. Thereon, in 1973, the radical Ambedkarite outfit, Dalit Panther, brought out their manifesto, and they defined the term as to include members of scheduled caste, tribes, neo-Buddhists, working people, landless people, poor peasants, women, and all those who are being exploited politically, economically, and in the name of religion. So Dalit is not a caste name, rather a political identity based on the common denominator of exploitation. Now, on the screen, I have some excerpts from observations of the...
By the way, Professor, we only see the cover of the presentation. If you are showing us slides, we're not able to see them.
Okay, give me a moment.
Yep.
Okay, so are you able to see the slides now?
No, only the cover. Okay. I think if you closed the, I think this is the read mode, right? When it takes up the entire screen.
Give me a moment. Give me a moment. I'm really sorry for this snag.
No, that's fine. That's more than fine.
Is it visible to you now?
No. If you could perhaps just share screen again and show your screen only.
Sure.
We can do it like how Professor SULJIĆ did.
One second. Okay. Now are you able to see?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank God I figured it out. The key arguments that I just presented a minute ago. Okay. And this is what I just mentioned about Dalits. I gave you the context about who these people are. Then here on the screen, this is what I was speaking about, that I have excerpts from the observations of the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination in India that were presented after International Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 2007. And the committee has made observations, and there are a number of observations. I've picked 4. Why? Because I'll be, in the poems that I'm discussing, all these somehow resonate. So the first concern was about the abolition of untouchability. Although Article 17 of the Indian Constitution abolishes it, the segregation of Dalit persists, in particular in rural areas, in access to places of worship, housing, hospitals, education, water resources, market, and other public places. Another concern was about arbitrary arrest, torture, and extrajudicial killings of members of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes by the police, and the frequent failure to protect these groups against acts of communal violence. Third concern was the alarming number of allegations of acts of sexual violence against Dalit women, primarily by men from dominant castes, in particular of rape and sexual exploitation. And then there were also concerns expressed about persistence of social norms of purity and pollution, which preclude intercaste marriage between Dalits and non-Dalits. So in the poems that we will be discussing today, we will see how the poets have tried to not only visibilize these facets, but also protest against them. Moving on, let me also tell you a bit about Dalit literature. So this is a flourishing body of literature that came into being from 1970s and onwards. And there are many autobiographies and many poems written by Dalits in vernaculars, but it is only recently that in English it is being produced. Just to summarize the aesthetics of this literature, I've quoted Sharan Kumar Dambale, a veteran Marathi Dalit writer, who in his book describes Dalit literature as precisely the literature which artistically portrays the sorrows, tribulations, slavery, degradation, ridicule, and poverty by Dalits. Every human being must find liberty, honor, security, and freedom from intimidation by powerful elements of society. These values are now being articulated in a particular kind of literature, its name being Dalit literature. In another instance, he gives us the three principles of Dalit literature's aesthetics. First is it rests on artists' social commitment. Second, it has life-affirming values present in artist creation. And third, it has the ability to raise the reader's consciousness of fundamental values like equality, freedom, justice, and fraternity. And the final quote is actually taken from one of the poets I'm going to discuss today. He encapsulates the spirit of this literature by saying, some poets write protest poems simply because they are privileged to. For us, what we write is protest. For us, we are the protest. Moving on to the poets. On the screen, I have mentioned the accolades and accomplishments of the poets that are being discussed today. The information is on the screen for all of you to read. I will be discussing poems published in Touch and Miss Militancy by Meena Kandasamy, some poems by Chandramohan Satyanathan published in Love After Babel and other poems, and a collection titled Blues from Bhimnagar by Yogesh Mehta. So we have reached the first thematic segment, and our discussion now would entail about caste and violence and its various dimensions. So on your screen, you have a poem by Meena Kandasamy titled Prayer. Let me give you a bit of context. So the poem is about a poor and deceased skinner of dead animals, a Dalit, who survives a severe bout of illness, typhoid, and in a state of partial recovery, drags himself to a temple to seek blessings and express his gratitude of an upper caste god. But this is not tolerated by one of the upper caste's man of the Kshatriya clan who kills him. So the poem is about the intolerance that Dalits have to face, and for centuries, they were not even allowed to enter temples. And temple entry movement has been a significant aspect of Dalit protest as well. So addressing that context, this poem actually makes dual strokes. It not only critiques or criticizes the upper caste for their brutality in crushing the spirits of Dalits, but it also highlights the servile mentality that has kept Dalits marginalized for centuries. So there is a tinge of sarcasm where she's criticizing the slave consciousness that Dalits have interpolated over centuries of subjugation. Now, an important Dalit ideologue, Raj Gautaman, has mentioned in his essay that Dalits who have been steeped in guilt, fear, despair, poverty, centuries of ignorance would find it very difficult to get rid of the slave mentality. And to do so, they would have to do it only by ignoring, attacking, humiliating, rejecting the hegemonic Brahmanical culture that enslaves them. So these poems you would see are actually voicing a counterculture and establishing Dalit aesthetics in the literary domain. The next poem, titled Liquid Tragedy Karmachedu, 1985, is based on atrocities that Dalits have to face. There have been numerous incidences in the past and in the recent years, but this one encapsulates one that happened in Andhra Pradesh in 1985. So the poem in this hieroglyphic form of a pot facilitates foregrounding the message that not only the most glaring discrimination against Dalits are practiced by denial of basic amenities like clean water, but the same pot, the vessel of containing pot, also becomes a tool of resistance. Let me give you a bit of context. So this tragedy unfolded after election clashes happened between two caste communities, the upper caste community Kamas and the lower caste or the Dalit community Madigas. Now this followed a spate of incidences after the untouchables had won the local elections, and it is believed that the upper caste would not tolerate it and they were itching for a kind of revenge. But what sparked this mayhem was a very small incident where upper caste men took their buffaloes and dirty bucket in which they fed the buffalo to wash in the water tank of the Madigas, of the Dalit people. So there was a young boy who resisted this, and these upper caste men couldn't tolerate, and they assaulted the boy. There was a woman who tried to intervene and actually used her pot to ward off the lashes of the hunters that were targeted at her. So this poem actually encapsulates both the denial of basic amenities as well as the resistance that Dalits are posing. However, because of the monopoly of the forward and dominant castes in the government machinery, there has been a kind of nexus where, they have their henchmen, and there is this nexus between the upper caste and the state agencies, because of which Dalits continue to feel exiled, and they are not given justice. They feel defenseless. Moving on to the next poem, this is by Yogesh Maitra from his collection. And here he speaks of extrajudicial killing of a man. He writes, ask a Pardi man who is abducted by police for a crime he did not do, gets shot in suspicious circumstances, whose murder cannot be proven in an absence of documents. You do not know about his death, and no paper exists to testify his name. In another poem called, it's about a soldier, a Dalit soldier who returns home after fighting shoulder to shoulder with upper caste men, but finds his family and himself ostracized. And this is about what Pramod Nair has called the post-colonial subalternization of Dalits, where exclusionary practices continue to alienate them as citizens, despite the constitutional promise of equality. On the screen next, we have a poem titled The Rape and the Murder of a Tribal. Now, this captures the peculiarities of deprivations faced by Dalit women and tribal women who feature at the bottom of the caste pyramid and hierarchy. These women are called Dalit among Dalits by National Federation of Dalit Women because they are thrice alienated on the basis of caste, then class, and then gender. In the caste framework, they are considered doubly polluted. Why? Because they are women, so periodical pollution happens through menstruation. And then because these women are engaged in occupations considered defiling, like scavenging and midwifery, there are there are aspersions cast on their characters, and upper caste men consider it as their right to sexually use them. So what happens is that there occur frequent cases of sexual assault, but these get unreported. So in Chandramohan's, this poem by Chandramohan visibilizes the complete denial of justice for these women, the denial of legal procedure, and their absence from mainstream feminist activism. As he writes, no TV channel discussions, no police officials were transferred or suspended, no candlelight marches, no billion women rising, a tribal girl was raped and murdered. There is a poem by Meena Kandasamy on the same theme titled Shame, where she scoffs the blatant injustice done to a gang-raped Dalit girl. And after the incident, the victim is blamed. However, the upper caste men who perpetrate the crime roam about scot-free because such incident has become much too commonplace. Then, although there is rampant discrimination primarily on caste basis in the rural areas, urban centers are not immune to it. And specifically, schools, colleges, institutions of education, we find caste discrimination continues to persist. Capturing that, this poem, One-Eyed by Meena Kandasamy, is about a young girl who is at the receiving end of virulent caste prejudice and is unjustly rendered corporal punishment for her harmless act of satiating thirst. Now, although untouchability was made a cognizable offense subject to penal punishment within the first decade of adoption of Constitution of India, the poor implementation of norms could not ameliorate the problems faced by Dalit. There have been a number of affirmative action reforms as well instituted by the government, but although Dalits have benefited, the ostracization continues in the contemporary times. And specifically, institutions, ambiguous modern institutions like universities are not devoid of such instances where Dalits encounter more insidious forms of harassment and they succumb to depression. And this is what this poem by Yogesh Maitreya captures when he says, "It is only in elite Savarna universities I heard the word depression for the first time. Otherwise, a Dalit basti where I was born and grew up, it is not new to see flowers bloom on stones and cement, even in devastated homes." So the last poem in this segment captures how caste functions in covert forms in urban context, where when people are the educated elite people who would not openly discriminate on caste basis are still very much inquisitive about caste status of people to decide whether to network or not, whether to associate with a person or not. So in a public transport situation, the poet finds himself addressing a volley of questions by an upper caste man. His insidious queries, incised with swift knife tongue, are like handshake prolonged to probe the pulse of my wrist. He tries assessing me with an in-swinger first. What is your full name? Then he tries an out-swinger that seems a lot. And what is your father's name? By this time, he loses his nerve and tries on a swift yorker. What is your caste? So the idea here is that where caste marks are not conspicuously visible, people use insidious questions to ascertain caste status of people. So caste is still a very much a huge reality today. We have reached the next segment on language. We'll be discussing English in Dalit context specifically. Let us begin with linguistic imperialism and the cultural colonization that India suffered under British colonization. So Dalit writers, when they use English as a medium of creative expression, are very much aware of the colonial baggage that this language comes with. So capturing the essence of linguistic imperialism, Chandramohan in his poem, untitled poem, writes, "The ship of conquest set sail along the sea routes. dropping anchor at every vernacular as if each vernacular were an undiscovered continent. In another poem, he writes, in the autobiography of my vernacular, there were a few suicide notes transliterated with an indelible ink, like the legacy of slave owners passed on to the hardbound of my poetry book, once a stepping pedestal for imperial books. Although there is this acknowledgement of the colonial baggage, Dalit poets are also aware of the emancipatory potential that this global language brings to them. They're aware that despite decolonization, these imperial languages hold sway and continue to hold sway in arenas like administration, education, and commerce as official languages. And they are also, like, we have English medium schools as the popular medium of instruction these days, where parents want to send children. And Dalits are also becoming well versed with this language. However, for them, this language holds dual potentiality. There is an inherent risk that this being language of power and privilege might alienate a huge segment of the Dalit population, as the benefits are available only to a small fraction. So it might lead to an establishment of an alternate hegemony. However, Dalits also look at English as a key to entry into the canons of world literature through translation and through creative expression. English was also the language that ideologues such as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and Phule had used to critique Brahminical supremacy. So Dalits are actually embracing English as a language of transformation, and they're trying to leverage it to form transnational solidarities. Indicating this attitude, we have a poem by Meena Kandasamy titled Mulligatawny. She reveals how language is intractably intertwined with concepts like identity, language, location, power, and ideology. She makes the popular curry-flavored soup the metaphor for claiming English as her language of self-expression. She writes, I dream of an English, and I'm skipping a few lines to the bottom, an English with more than 36 words to call the sea, an English that doesn't belittle brown or black men or women, an English of tasting with 5 fingers. So these poets are not mimicking aesthetics of English literature and poetry, rather attempting to make English their own language. Then we have reached the last segment, which is about transnational solidarities that these poets are trying to form with marginalized communities from across the globe. The first poem on the screen is titled We Real Hot. It was inspired by We Real Cool, written by Gwendolyn Brooks. So in this poem, the original poem, Brooks had addressed the boldness and insecurity of a bunch of young schoolboys through a few well-placed words. These boys spend their entire day in a dingy pool hall rather than going to school. So the poem captures their sense of pride in defying conventions. Kandasamy uses this poem as a mold to express. The original poem has been transformed and used as a mold to express the newfound confidence of Dalits who have begun to assert pride in their Dalit identity. They are the speaking subjects, not afraid to show their resentment at the injustices done to them. They retaliate, they counterattack, they confront discrimination, and they defy providence. Kandasamy admits the influence of African-American writers like Gwendolyn Brooks and Langston Hughes. In her words, it was from them she learned that poetry was resistance. In an interview, she also states that there is great deal of commonality between racial discrimination and caste, as both of them are birth-based and emanate from xenophobia. To her, there is a lot to be shared, not just in terms of solidarity and support, but in terms of dialogue and engagement and lessons from each other's experience. Then the next poem by Chandra Mohan again borrows from a popular poem titled Strange Fruit, written by Abel Meeropol, about the lynching of Black people that was at the height in the southern United States at the turn of the 20th century. And then he uses this poem, the reference, to rewrite the myth of Shambhuka. So just to give you a bit of context, Shambhuka this is an episode in Vedic literature, an Indian epic called Ramayana. There are several versions. The version I'm referring to is Valmiki's Ramayana, where Shambhuka, who was a Shudra, was doing penance, severe penance and religious service to attain godlike stature. But because he was not from an upper caste Brahmin, segment, Lord Ram, the virtuous King Lord Ram, beheads this person. Gods from the heaven actually after this incident applaud Ram for safeguarding their interest. So again, there is a lot of dispute around this. Some people feel that this is not part of the original epic but was a later day addition. However, Dalits have been rewriting myths to show such figures as victims. Figures that have been obliterated, they claim them as representatives of Dalits who are being ostracized through caste prejudice. So what Chandramohan does here is he rewrites the myth, and then this poem is actually about suicide of Dalit Bahujan students and institutions of higher education in India. A recent and a very well-known case being of Rohit Vemula, where these students hang themselves after suffering years of injustice and ostracization, unable to cope with the pressures. Finally, we have this poem by Chandramohan, Learning from the Panthers. The title itself is very clear how, Dalit poets have been borrowing not just their tactics, actions, stance, and rhetoric. They are being inspired by the Black Panthers and the Black Panthers movement. Chandramohan writes, "The Panthers march ahead of us. We foray into spaces between pages in the time's crevice, not to trip on the shadow lines of arcane monuments." And it is a known fact that Dalit Panthers, the radical Ambedkarite outfit that emerged in the 1970s, was actually inspired by the Black Panthers, the African American Black Panthers, and their civil rights movement in 1966. We have reached almost the end of the presentation, the conclusion here. So we saw that Dalit poets are claiming English language to transcode Dalit aesthetics into post-colonial Indian poetry in English. By writing resistance literature against the entrenched Brahminical cultural praxis dominant in mainstream poetry, they are inducing a paradigmatic anti-caste shift in the normative propensities of content, theme, tone, and imagery in the status quoist and depoliticized corpus. Poems emanate from their political commitment to annihilate caste oppression. They are used to force the reader to comprehend the peculiar tenacity and complexity of caste in perpetrating human rights violations of Dalits. Oftentimes dismissed just as a feudal vestige, a parochial mentality on the wane, caste contradictorily continues to thrive in the contemporary times in mutated forms. These are the works that I have cited in my presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Pratibha, for the beautiful presentation. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to either turn on your microphone or type them down. All right. So as I've said earlier, since we have used up all of our lunch break, instead of a long one, we're going to take a very short break, about 5 minutes. And after that, we will resume with the next presenter, Professor Gillian M, at, let's say, exactly 12:45. So until then, take care. So we will reconvene in 5 minutes.
Okay. All right. Okay, so, okay, where has my screen?
Thank you so much. I'm sorry for this.
Okay.
You may start whenever you.
Okay, yeah. All right. So, the indigenous view of the land is not purchasable. And of course, I think I really want to relate this to our situation in the world today, where we are destroying the ecosystem. And if we don't take care, very soon we won't have a planet to live on. And of course, we need to learn this from the indigenous, that their life, of course, is not conditional on us learning this, but they do have something very key to teach us. So I was talking about the buffalo as they are being slaughtered, and then the people too that are referred to here, the people I had wrapped, being destroyed through influenza and consumption. They travelled lame and bent with chests darkened from the blood they coughed out of their lungs, filing forward and gathering. I saw them dragging one another in slings and litters. I saw their unborn children hanging limp or strapped to their backs, which very much reminded me of Hand D, which is Shakespeare's contribution to Thomas More, the unplayed and unpublished partial play, describing the whole situation of migrants being turned out of England in the 13th century, Jewish amongst them. Briefly coming to tracks now, we see that such slaughter of indigenous, legally or illegally, is shown very forcefully in tracks where the Indians are up against the legal forces of America. And we see here the Lord obviously made the whites more shrewd. They grew in number. The Indians receded and coughed to death and drank. And so what we see this procedure whereby the original population of America, the Americas, they gradually get shrunk into smaller and smaller settlements of land. And here, the northern parts, under harsh wintry conditions, in dreadful poverty, caught in legal financial traps, forcing them to give up their land with annual fee lists and foreclosure notices sent by the agent. As families get behind on their payments, or tricks are made to force them off the land. And the people die, the land has no heirs, lumber companies cut down the trees. It's very much like the end of the cherry orchard, as the end of tracks is just like the end of cherry orchard, where you have a class which is being destroyed in Russia. So you have the indigenous people being destroyed in North America. Now, coming specifically,
recording in progress.
Coming specifically to the situation in the Night Watchman, which is very moving, they are offered a final solution. Just sounds just like Hitler, doesn't it, of the Jewish people, that the Holocaust. The final solution of 1953 is offered by the US government in this House Concurrent Resolution Bill 108. And the Emancipation Bill, intended to permanently solve the American Indian issue, effectively a final solution to the existence of Indians in the US, among, I believe, the most extensive genocides the world has seen. This bill resolved to abrogate nation-to-nation treaties that had been made with American Indian nations for as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow. And they attempt to terminate 5 tribes with the ultimate aim of exterminating native tribes and their independent existence in North America. And this character, who is actually showing Louise Erdrich's uncle, Thomas, he relates this perennial struggle. They were issued with government seed wheat, plough, and an ox to enable them to farm the land that produced so little that despite experimenting with various crops, they barely survived the winters and were often unable to walk by spring. So Thomas Muskrat was asked, relates they had survived smallpox, the Winchester repeating rifle, the Hotchkiss gun and tuberculosis, the flu epidemic of 1918, and fought in 4 or 5 deadly United States wars. Now he is struggling to grow up with 1 meal a day at the reservation school. Eventually the family decide to cut off his pigtail or plait, and it was hung in the woods to enable him to return home. And he walked to the government boarding school where they were actually giving them 3 meals a day. So he learns to read and write, he learns various skills. And by the time the novel is starting, we have this question of emancipation or termination with this bill, which he learns about from the Minot News of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, targeted by US Congress for emancipation, effectively a way of freeing Indians from being Indians or from life. Of course, we have a sort of wordplay here, simultaneously freeing the government from all the treaties that they had ever signed with the native peoples. So this bill, 1953, under the name of emancipation, Indians call it termination, propose the relocation of the Indians to the cities and other urban areas, so effectively terminating all federal support and of the Turtle Mountain Agency, while they, in the process, they are supposed to surrender any identity they may yet retain as the original owners or inhabitants of the American continent. As he says, they're just going to take our land away from us. In 5 years, all the land on the reservation would be in white hands, and we would be trudging up the roads with our children, trying to find a place to light. We have this character, Watkins, who appears to be a Mormon. It's a Native American Indian. Actually, of course, the indigenous, the pagan spirituality is the original American religion. If you've seen the Book of Mormon, you will know what a ludicrous religion the Mormon religion is. The mastermind is Watkins, whose father had been filing on land in Utah in communication with Joseph Smith, as the Utah people were relieved of 13.8 million acres of land that had been guaranteed by the executive orders of first President Abraham Lincoln and later Chester Arthur. Joseph Smith and the early Mormons had tried their best to murder all Indians in their path across the country, but in the end did not quite succeed. The Book of Mormon asserts that the Mormons had been divinely gifted the land, all the land they wanted. Why? Calling Indians Lamanites, who needed to atone for the putative sins of Laman. Of course, it's a fairy tale. The whole book was an excuse to get rid of Indians. And so this bill provides for the termination of federal supervision over the property of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa Indians in the states of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and their members, for assistance in the orderly relocation of such Indians in areas of greater economic opportunity. Yeah, send them all to the cities where of course, they won't have work. The seal is interesting in showing the white American with his rifle right behind him, ready to shoot Indians. It implies genocide. And so the character here says, this is Thomas, you're not going to charge us taxes, he suggests, to live on the land, which is all that remains after your people stole the rest of it. And so these indigenous, whose animistic, shamanistic, or pantheistic religion is actually the Native American religion, although many of them have converted to Christianity, they inhabit pole and mud buildings with dirt floors. They haul their own water from sloughs and springs, and they light their homes with kerosene. This is the middle of the 20th century, remaining largely without electricity or plumbing. The proposed bill intends to renege on any recognition of their rights to land ownership, making them equal with whites, while stripping them of the little land they still retain, which is largely unfarmable because they've got all the bits that are left over, reneging on all the treaties that were made to last as long as the grass grows and the river flows. The vocabulary of the bill refers to disposition of federally owned property. Such Indians may be discontinued as no longer necessary, or lands to be and sold and deposit the proceeds of the sale. They're just going to be dispossessed. And so we have this bill, we have the build up to the bill, and we have the indigenous Indians getting together their delegation. They go up to Washington, and they have one researcher who has historical roots in Marie Baldwin and Sister Hilga, of people who had been researching the Indians, generally mixed blood. And all they were able to do was to gain time. The relocation plan is ill-timed. They were scrupulously polite. Thomas himself went afterwards to apologize and to sort of thank Watkins for his time. At the end, they were not completely terminated, only pretty much systematically decimated. Another source which I found on JSTOR, I think it's a mirror image there, Reveal Digital relates how you have to get rid of Indians, deny the Indians their human rights, make them a non-person, give token promotion, of course, divide and rule, make them work for insignificant victories, etc. This is a long-held American policy. We see in the life conditions of the Indians that they were granted the vote. Edric usually calls them Indians. I'm playing between indigenous, whatever. They were granted the vote in 1924 after blacks and women. She sort of says the good news is they're poor enough to require government help. The bad news is they're just plain poor. The good news in the Night Watchman is that they do open a jewel plant nearby that offers a job for maybe half a dozen, 6 or 8 of them, with eye-destroying, body-destroying precision work. The bad news is that generally Indians fall prey to predators. For women, the fate is generally prostitution. For men, it more often tends to be alcoholism, like Patrice's father, who drinks himself to death. She talks a fair bit about the protagonist, Patrice, working at the jewel plant. Her sister, they hunt to find the sister. She goes to Minnesota, marries. Her husband disappears. She gets trapped in prostitution in the hold of a ship, and she becomes the men that, you know, she never comes out into the open air. The men just constantly use her as a tool. She becomes completely mentally and physically destroyed, almost to death. Before she actually dies, the men decide to dump her rather than leaving her dead body as evidence against them. She's foamed and shat so horrifyingly. They dress her in a man's clothes and stick her up on the dock. She's thrown by this roadside. She ends up by the roadside, and a rescuer, a medical worker, actually, instead of taking her to the hospital where he thinks she won't get any decent treatment, he guesses what has been happening to her from her state of twitchiness, shaking, jumpy eyes, bad dreams, swelling of sobs, attempt to hide her fears, eyes rolling back. In the sentence, I'm going to skip this part, a similar case of prostitution, but Patrice, in looking for her sister, she comes to a place where her sister must have been staying, where she finds her name. She finds a dying dog. She finds collars approached to the wall. There's no evidence of any food, but she sees excrement on the floor, and the dog somehow sort of conveys to her that her sister must have died there. Well, actually, the sister somehow survives. We see how the censuses are done when most Indians were off hunting. They only counted full bloods. So legally, we're again in the legal world. They result in 20 townships being mashed down to 2 townships, leaving Indians starved for lack of land and food, not enough land or farmable land, not enough animals, fish or birds, never enough jobs. And getting it wrong meant people starved dead. We don't have enough land or our people in one place ever since. And in the meantime, the government acts like the Indians owed them something. But wasn't it the other way round? We see in the recent case, in the sentence, the case of George Floyd, being unable to breathe, the entire native population is propelled into sympathetic reactive rebellion. But a statement is made here. He was photographed. Indians would not normally be photographed while dying under abuse because they live in such outlying, isolated places under conditions of such egregious property. And so I'm drawing to a close here, having put together all this information from various of her novels, and I'm returning to the Indian spirituality. God, Gizhe, Manidu, the pagan empathy with nature and Mother Earth, I find very compelling. The indigenous Indians whom Edric's works relate range from sustaining their spirituality, animism, or pantheistic religion, very often at the same time, fully integrated, pretty much integrated into Christianity. For example, Patrice's mother had been kept away from school in order to maintain the oral traditions of the people, their culture. And to Patrice, growing up as a Catholic, she says these concepts, God, Gizhe, Manidu, or whatever, the Holy Ghost, were simply labels to cover the vaster, impersonal, yet personal, nameless greatness that she sees at work in her tribe. And so drawing to a conclusion here, of course, not all the Indians have been wiped out, but we know that they have been massacred over the years. And Louise Erdrich is speaking out for them very forcefully, very powerfully. My closing statement, the world is far closer to needing pagan spirituality now as millennia of religious human domination, dominion over nature, Genesis 1, I think it's Genesis 1 or 3, is it, over nature has destroyed so much of our planet. Of course, Indian people's lives should not be under threat. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Gillian M. Thank you so much. By the way, I've heard about you for years, and I'm so glad that I finally got to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I did try very hard to speak fairly compactly. I had a lot of exciting things to say. Thank you for your attention.
No, thank you. Thank you, Professor. So do we have any questions from the audience? If not, okay. I'm just going to go along. So next up is Rachael FRANKE, doctor or PhD candidate, sorry. So Rachael FRANKE from University of Freiburg. She's a PhD candidate in North American literature at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland. Her current research employs Kimberly Cranshaw's theory of intersectionality and Andrea Riley's maternal theory to analyze representations of motherhood in contemporary novels set in the US South. Her master's thesis, titled Missing Mothers, Split Sisters, the Reimagining of Lost History Through Trauma Transmission and Reconciliation, examines transgenerational trauma in Black mother-daughter relationships. In November 2022, she presented Dismissal and Misdiagnosis as Patriarchal Silencing in the Yellow Wallpaper and the Story of an Hour at the Swiss Association of North American Studies conference in Freiburg, Switzerland. In June 2023, she will lead a talk on war narratives titled Lyrical Reimaginings of a Conflicted Childhood at Representations of Home conference in Lisbon, Portugal. Her presentation is titled Colorblind or Racialized Reflections in North American Memoirs. You have the floor.
Lovely. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for the university and the committee for the organization and for having me.
Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to try to share my slides here. Perfect. I hope you can see that okay. And I'm also going to go ahead and set a timer to hopefully manage to say somewhat on time.
Thank you so much. And we can see the slides.
Perfect. Excellent. So yes, my name is Rachel, and my presentation today is titled Colorblind or Racialized Reflections in North American Memoirs. My table of contents, I've split the presentation into 4 steps, if you will. First, discussing the concepts of intersectionality and the matrix of domination in identifying and combating systemic racism. Then I'll briefly discuss 2 camps in the ideas behind racial consciousness in the US and Canada. The memoirs I'll be talking about today are Ta-Nehisi Coates' 2015 Between the World and Me and David Cheriandi's 2018 I've Been Meaning to Tell You. Finally, I'll define critical race theory and the role it plays in literature and its real-world application. First, identifying and combating systemic racism. The term intersectionality was coined by civil rights advocate Kimberly Crenshaw in her 1989 article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. Her metaphor of the intersection is meant to exemplify how a person's various identifiers, such as age, race, and sexuality, are interlocked. Quote, discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction, and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them, end quote. Intersectionality stresses that in lived experience, an individual is a complete whole, constructed of perceived and self-identified characteristics. In 1990, sociologist Patricia Hill Collins wrote in Black Feminist Thought of a concept she calls the matrix of domination, expanding on the concept of intersectionality as being a local reality with historic and social construction. Quote, as the particular form assumed by intersecting oppression in any one location, any matrix of domination can be seen as a historically specific organization of power in which social groups are embedded and which they aim to influence, end quote. She writes further that, quote, the concept of a matrix of domination encapsulates the universality of intersecting oppressions as organized through diverse local realities, end quote, which is to say, for this presentation, I'm discussing a matrix of domination particular to the United States and Canada due to their history and socio-political environments. Racial consciousness. I'm going to briefly talk about 2 opposing approaches to race and racial consciousness emerging and continuing in North America, specifically in Canada and the United States. The first stance is an intentional, overt recognition of identity-based norms and stereotypes to reappropriate and reclaim self-identification. In 1985, philosopher Luce Irigaray wrote in This Sex Which Is Not One of a tactic for women to lean into stereotypes to overturn them. She writes, quote, to convert a form of subordination into an affirmation and thus to begin to thwart it. To play with mimesis is thus for a woman to try to recover the place of her exploitation by discourse without allowing herself to simply be reduced to it. End quote. While Irigaray focuses on gender identity, this concept is recognized in gender, sexuality, and race studies. In her 1988 article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, literary theorist Gayatri Spivak writes of intentional generalization to achieve deconstruction. She describes, quote, a strategic use of positivist essentialism in a scrupulously visible political interest, end quote. A criticism of these self and group essentialisms is that it is absolutely crucial that these solidarity tactics be aligned with deconstructive politics. Otherwise, there's a huge risk of harmful generalization and of reinforcing stereotypes. Racial colorblindness, on the other hand, is on the rise with sentiments such as I don't see race and all lives matter. Psychologist Monica Williams explains that, quote, colorblind ideology aims to treat individuals as equally as possible without regard to race, end quote, which, while the intentions may be well-meaning, ignores and rejects continued disparity, oppression, and violence faced by marginalized groups. Scholar Barbara Tomlinson highlights the inherent problem with racial colorblindness, which is the dismissal of lived experience and of group standpoint. Quote, people who see themselves as colorblind in a society suffused with racist oppression and exploitation are not so much evading color as evading acknowledgement of power, end quote. So what you've been waiting for, getting into the memoirs now. The first one is Between the World and Me, published in 2015 by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is a best-selling memoir written by the American author who's also a former national correspondent. It is written as a letter to the author's son to prepare him for what it means to be a Black teenager and a Black man in the United States. Coates reflects on their generational differences, particularly in regard to faith in the criminal justice system, when his son believes the police officers responsible for killing 18-year-old Michael Brown in Missouri in 2014 would be charged. As Coates predicted, the officers are found not guilty and his son is devastated. The author considers how we use language to sugarcoat the real world of violence those words represent. Quote, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth, end quote. Coates is explicit with his understanding of the institution of policing to be founded on racist ideology. He writes, quote, it is not necessary that you believe that the officer who choked Eric Gardner set out that day to destroy a body. All you need to understand is that the officer carries with him the power of the American state and the weight of an American legacy, and they necessitate that of the bodies destroyed every year, some wild and disproportionate number of them will be Black, end quote. These citations demonstrate the intersectional experience of the author in the US matrix of domination and his fears for his own child who'll be growing up in this world that racializes him and simultaneously attempts to deny the fact that race-based discrimination and violence continues to exist. In I've Been Meaning to Tell You, A Letter to My Daughter, which was published in 2018, the Canadian writer and professor of literature, David Cheriandy, writes to his 13-year-old daughter. The author has African and Indian ancestry, with his parents immigrating to Canada from Trinidad. He reflects on his child's racial identity as mixed race, as her mother is a white Canadian as well. The author is in awe of his daughter's self-assuredness and bravery when thinking about his own youth, and marvels at how she identifies as Canadian without feeling she needs to explain herself further. Cheriandy reflects on his fears and concerns watching the 2017 US presidential inauguration and stresses Canada's false belief of, quote, being better than their southern neighbor, as he and his family attend a vigil following a shooting at a mosque in Quebec City that same year. Reflecting on the Islamophobic attack, he writes, quote, but the fact is that I require little imagination to understand what it feels like to be considered dispensable by the powerful within a country, to be viewed as unconnected to the fabric of Canadian society, or as a threat, singled out in lines and at borders, visibly targeted by those who are, in fact, the most secure. I do not empathize with victims of bigotry and racism. I know the feeling intimately and viscerally, end quote. Writing to his daughter on the topic of achieving equality through colorblindness and erasure of difference, he reflects, quote, I have heard some well-wishing folk proclaim people like you the happy future for humankind, imagining that racial prejudice will come to an end when everyone, through countless intermixings, achieves the same features and tone of brown. Forgive me, dearest one, but I don't share this hope. The future I yearn for is not one in which we'll all be clothed in sameness, but one in which we'll finally learn to both read and respectfully discuss our differences. The author recognizes that while gendered, racialized, and class discrimination and oppression cannot be exchanged for others, he does know what it is to be discriminated against and oppressed on the basis of his own intersectional identity. He does not believe that erasing difference will result in the overcoming of racism, but that respectful recognition and acceptance of different lived experience is the only way to truly progress. critical race theory. So bringing it back into the law, I wanted to discuss a little bit about the necessity of critical race theory that the memoirs have already demonstrated. So defining critical race theory, CRT is a theory that emerged in the post-civil rights era, but it's mainly recognized as a framework which took shape in the 70s and 80s by scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw, who I've already mentioned, Derek Bell, and Richard Delgado, to name a few. It is an interdisciplinary concept which argues that race is a socially constructed idea which has historically been ingrained in modern institutions. It examines racial bias in housing, education, and especially in the criminal justice system. Professor Kristen Adedonian defines CRT as providing, quote, an important premise for the historical context of how present-day racial inequality and oppression should be analyzed. It illustrates how killings and violence by police are a consistent, persistent, and inescapable truth for Black men, end quote. Now I have here a small map that demonstrates where critical race theory has been banned, where they are considering banning it. This is both in education, so if a public institution wants to receive federal funding, they cannot teach it, and also where it can no longer be implemented in law. Currently, there's an ongoing push to ban critical race theory, both the teaching and the application of it, due to the ill-informed belief that it causes division. In 2014, criminologist Sonia Starr's research into arrest and incarceration rates determined that, quote, nearly 80% of Black arrestees are incarcerated, compared with only 68% of white arrestees. And Black arrestee sentences are, on average, over 2 years longer for the same crime. We are all aware of the Black Lives Matter protests in response to the filmed and widely circulated footage of the brutality committed against Black men by the police. As both Between the World and Me and I've Been Meaning to Tell You demonstrate, neither the United States nor Canada are post-racial countries. Colorblind ideology neglects to address systemic violence and issues ingrained in modern institutions. Critical race theory is not teaching or creating racial division. It is acknowledging and combating the racial bias that the law was built on. So I've really sped through here. And in conclusion, as the scholars mentioned in this presentation, including Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, Luz Irigaray, Beatrice Spivak, among others, have theorized, and Ta-Nehisi Coates and David Cheriandi have eloquently demonstrated in their memoirs, there is a necessity to recognize and acknowledge intersectional identity and the way in which different people experience the world. In this way, literature can work hand in hand with the law to dismantle systemic and institutional racial bias through intentional, deconstructive, anti-racist movements. In the words of educator Amy Van Wagenen, critical race theory seeks its own end, and the strategy is to destroy the conditions of its own making. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And of course, thank you for speeding up through the presentation, but you have managed to make it very poignant and concise and very much intelligible at the same time. So thank you for that. So without any further ado, I would like to move on with the next presenter, Srebrenka MAČKOVIĆ from University of Sarajevo. She is a senior teaching assistant at the English department at the University of Sarajevo Faculty of Philosophy, born on February the 24th, 1988 in Tuzla, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and holds a BA and MA degree in English Language and Literature from the University of Sarajevo Faculty of Philosophy English Department, currently enrolled in a PhD program at Faculty of Philosophy and working on a PhD thesis titled Position and Artistic Transposition of Subaltern and the Other in Selected Prose Works by Afro-American and Postcolonial Authors and their respective film and TV adaptations. And academic interests include British, American, and postcolonial literature, cultural studies, literary theory, film and adaptation studies. Dear MAČKOVIĆ, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so first I want to thank everyone from Topkapı University for organizing this conference. And I must tell you that I had issues all day connecting to the Zoom call. I am constantly being kicked out whenever I connect from my computer. So I'm using my phone at the moment. And I'm not sure whether you can hear me.
That's fine.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that you cannot see my presentation. I guess you cannot see me as well because I have difficulty setting up the phone. So the mic is on. So this is why I'm very sorry, but you can only hear my voice. I don't know if
we will be very
okay.
glad to listen to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So as you already heard, my name is Srebrenka MAČKOVIĆ, and I will be talking about Hanif Kureishi's My Son, the Fanatic. And I would like to start with just few words on immigration in Britain in general, because we all know that immigration is a global phenomenon that brings cultural diversity and it enriches societies. But the process of assimilation and establishing one's identity in a new country is almost always, if not always, accompanied by a set of unique challenges for both the first and the second generation immigrants. And first generation immigrants often face cultural alienation due to the stark contrast between their home country and the host nation. Many of them struggle with the language, customs, social norms, which can hinder their integration and self-identification. Another issue here is so-called dual identity, because many first-generation immigrants grapple with the dilemma of preserving their cultural heritage while adapting to the values and practices of the new society. And this conflict can lead to a sense of displacement and ambiguity in their identity formation. The third great problem is, of course, discrimination and stereotyping, because first-generation immigrants may encounter prejudice, racism, stereotyping, which can negatively impact their self-esteem and confidence. And these challenges can make it difficult for them to establish a positive self-identity within the British society. When it comes to second-generation immigrants, cultural hybridity is definitely one of the main issues, because second-generation immigrants often navigate between their ancestral culture and the mainstream British culture. They face the challenge of reconciling with parents' traditions, with their own experiences growing up in a different cultural context, which can create a sense of identity fragmentation. Of course, another issue the second-generation immigrants face is this intergenerational conflict, which is a product of cultural differences between the second-generation immigrants and their parents. And the clash between traditional values and modern lifestyles can further complicate their identity development and cause feelings of isolation. And also there is a notion of integration versus assimilation, since second-generation immigrants may struggle with the pressure to assimilate into the dominant culture while maintaining a connection with their heritage. So this balancing act can result in a sense of not fully belonging to either culture. And all these issues are explored in Hanif Kureishi's short story, My Son, the Fanatic. And this story is a powerful exploration of the impact of immigration on cultural identity of first and second generation immigrants, since it examines the complexities and nuances of maintaining one's cultural heritage while also assimilating into a foreign culture. It is indicative of Kureishi's artistic transposition of the series of issues that he struggled with as a son of an immigrant, and those are issues such as hybridity, mimicry, interculturality, and the position of subaltern and other in Britain at the end of the 21st century. This story is set in an unnamed city in England with no precise timeline provided. Still, if we take into consideration the time when the story was published, as well as cultural and historical references in it, My Son, the Fanatic can be placed in the late 1980s or early 1990s in a bleak suburban neighborhood of an industrial town somewhere in the north of the country. Some claim that the story is set in the industrial outskirts of London, while others believe that the story takes place in the city of Bradford, which had become known worldwide not only for its sizable multicultural community, but also for the radical Islamist groups that, among other things, were one of the first ones in the world to burn Rushdie's controversial book, Satanic Verses, in 1989 publicly. According to those sources, Qureshi, who was very vocal in defending Rushdie's work, was sending a strong message with his choice of the city. Ultimately, the location may be insignificant in and of itself, as it could be equally applicable to any similar environment at that time. The central figures in this narrative are Pervez and his son Ali, and the story highlights the challenges they face in their attempts to overcome aforementioned cultural conflict between their Pakistani heritage and Western values of the society they live in. On the surface, it seems that Pervez, who is a first-generation immigrant from Pakistan, managed to successfully integrate into British society, and he enjoys all the freedoms that this country has to offer. He's pleased that he had found a place where he can do whatever he feels like, since, and I quote, "they let you do almost anything here." Unlike the country he had left in search of a better life. It also seemed that his son Ali, who is a second-generation immigrant, had fully accepted the British lifestyle and was, and I quote, "a normal British boy who liked and enjoyed all things his peers liked and enjoyed." This story begins in medias res, with Pervez actually noticing that something strange is happening with his son. His room is getting empty, he's getting rid of his belongings he had previously been very attached to, such as an electronic guitar, posters, videotapes, and Pervez actually suspects that his son had become a drug addict and is now selling his things to get money for drugs. He does not know how to approach him, and he does not know whom to talk to because he's too embarrassed to talk about this with his friends, his fellow taxi drivers, because he always spoke proudly of his son's achievements and judged them, his friends, whenever they would confide in him about problems they had with their children. And this is why he decided to talk to one of his frequent customers about this issue, his regular customer, Bettina, who is a prostitute, whom he often drove home after her night shift. He believed that she, as someone who had seen everything, would know what to look for in terms of signs of drug use, but he also believed that because of her profession and lifestyle, she would never judge him if it turns out that his son is actually a drug addict. Following her advice, he decided to spy on him one morning, and what he discovered shook him to his core. His son was a practicing Muslim. And this partially explains why he started growing a beard, why he broke up with the local English girl who used to come to the house, and why he's no longer hanging out with his friends. It also explained the empty room, since he was getting rid of all the things that did not fit in his new lifestyle. And although this realization calmed him for a moment, he was still not quite sure what to make of this whole situation, since he had no idea where Ali even learned to pray, since Pervez, by his own account, has been running away from religion after a traumatic experience in a religious school in Lahore, where he went as a boy. And one of the main reasons why he decided to move to a foreign Western country was not to be frowned upon for choosing not to practice religion, eat and drink whatever he feels like eating or drinking, and behave however he feels like without being judged. And this is where Qureshi opens up a major theme in the story, which is religion and its relation to identity. Although Pakistan was known as a conservative country in which religion plays an important role, it is clear that Pervez, as well as all the people from his circle, the taxi drivers with whom Pervez is associated with, both professionally and personally, because they are his only friends, do not take religion too seriously. Perhaps this is due to the nature of their job, because their job brings them into contact with various people, but also because of their own stance that in life one should not be a slave to strict religious rules, but enjoy life to the fullest. Moreover, Ali grew up in a household where Pervez talked about this very openly, so it wasn't a secret. And the reason why Pervez was unable to understand how his son became not only interested in, this is the reason why he couldn't understand why he or how he became interested in religion, and not just interested, but started practicing it devotedly. Judging by Ali's age and previous way of life, he was born and raised in England, meaning that he was a second-generation immigrant. As previously mentioned, he did not differ from his peers in any way. He was an excellent student, loved and excelled in various sports. He was preparing to finish school for an accountant, and after getting a good job, he was supposed to marry the right girl and start a family. He never talked about having any issues fitting in, and this is why Pervez was so confused as to why his son was straying away from the path he had envisioned for him. And this is something that happens in these households. So parents want better life for their children, and this is why they create this perfect path for them. And this is what Pervez did, and he was so perplexed that Ali is now straying away from it. This is why he wanted to talk to him, and this is why they went to have a dinner. And the dialogue they had there shattered Pervez's world, since the conversation revealed that Ali was not just interested in religion, but he was radicalized by Islamic fundamentalists. For Pervez, England was the promised land, the land of opportunities, the land where he worked hard for 10 hours a day to provide his son with a better life. The land he loved because no one forbade him anything there. And for Ali, this was actually a major issue. Pervez realized early that in order to fit in to the liberal ways that had eroded the once Puritan and conservative British population in the second half of the 20th century, and under the influence of the freer currents from the US after the decade-long struggle for civil rights, the hippie movement, the flower children, there was significant change in the views of the British population. As the country lost its former imperial holdings around the world and descended into an increasingly severe economic and social crisis, the strict moral norms weakened. There was a turn to the Marxist carpe diem, enjoy life to the fullest, and this is why he can't understand, let alone accept, that Ali has decided to lead an ascetic life full of humility and desire to establish his new identity by strictly adhering to religious laws. Pervez points out how Ali should be glad that he was given a chance to have a different life than the one he had while growing up in Lahore, but Ali openly tells him how he will burn in hell, and I quote, burn in hell with other infidels, for drinking alcohol and consuming prohibited haram food. Pervez was deeply hurt to hear how his son sees him, because he was a man who devoted his life to creating opportunities for his son. He never had any hobbies in life. He never traveled. He never spent money on any luxuries for himself or his wife. He worked hard and invested all his money in his son and his education in an effort to provide him with greater opportunities and success within the given British framework and standard of living. And although it seems that Pervez was successful in his efforts to assimilate, it is not difficult to understand that the process of acculturation came at certain cost. He was working long 10-hour night shifts as a taxi driver to provide for his family. He socializes exclusively with other taxi drivers who are also Punjabi, which paints a somewhat stereotypical picture of the life of an immigrant who, despite his best efforts, in many ways is an outsider to British society. That is why he doesn't feel uncomfortable in Bettina's company, because he knows that both of them are, when it comes to the place in the British class system, are on the margin. He as a disdained Pakistani immigrant, and she as a rejected fallen woman. Her profession doesn't bother him, nor his origin bother her, since both Pervez and Bettina are in the position of subaltern and other. Mutual understanding and respect have developed between them. Both feel a certain degree of liberation from rigid social relationships, and his taxi is just that type of a free territory where they can say anything to each other without any fear. And it is no wonder that Pervez confides in her, just as he initially tried with his taxi drivers from his homeland. He believes in her experiences, he's ready to do whatever she advises him, and shares his knowledge with her without any hesitation, including his disappointments and deepest frustration. And to go back to Pervez and Ali's conversation in the restaurant, in this exchange, Ali's eloquence is revealed. which, regardless of his awareness or admission of it, is a result of his previous education within the British school system. His new discourse is literally Foucauldian power discourse, which paradoxically arose from the little religious Islamic doctrine he had heard from the local Islamic teacher. For what Ali now preaches to Pervez, it was clear that this is a discourse of radical political Islam focused on what is wrong in Western culture. And I quote, "But I love England," Pervez said, watching his boy in the mirror. "They let you do almost anything here." "That is the problem," he replied. In this conversation, he also blamed his father for staying away from God's path, not adhering to the rules of his religion, and breaking the rules of Quran, accusing him of being too implicated in the Western civilization. Pervez was perplexed by this statement and tried to explain that he's implicated in Western civilization because, I quote, "we live here." To which Ali replied with, and I quote once again, "The Western materialists hate us. Papa, how can you love something which hates you?" From this, the tension between the secular liberal values that Pervez holds dear and the strict interpretation of Islam that Ali embraces is more than clear. Ali's fundamentalism is direct rejection of the Western lifestyle and values that Pervez has adopted, and this threatened to undermine the very foundation of Pervez's identity. Ali's rejection of Western culture is a rejection of the secular liberal values, and it also highlights the difficulties of second-generation immigrants in finding a sense of belonging in a multicultural society. Pervez's identity crisis, although less pronounced, is rooted in the feeling of not fully belonging to either culture. Despite the success of integration and efforts to assimilate, he still feels like an outsider in British society and is constantly aware of the racism and prejudice he faces. On the other hand, his son's rejection of Western culture and embrace of a strict interpretation of Islam reminds Pervez of the traditional and conservative society he left behind in Pakistan. This creates a sense of alienation and disconnection from both cultures, leaving him feeling lost and without a sense of belonging. Pervez's immigration experience and the cultural identity of his son, Ali, both reflected in the complexities and nuances of maintaining one's cultural heritage while also assimilating to a new culture. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to ask if I spent all my time.
I mean, normally speaking, you have 2 or 3 minutes more.
Okay.
If you'd like to, you can use them.
Okay, I will just skip certain things and just focus on something that is very important.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
And I will finish off with that, not to waste any more time. I want to say that with the two of them, actually, the roles have changed a bit. So Ali acts as an overbearing British colonial father towards the misguided colonial son, although Ali is the son and Pervez is a father. And this is an excellent example of mimicry and ambivalence as interpreted by Homi Bhabha, because Pervez has almost completely imitated the way of life of the country he came to in search of happiness and better opportunities without looking back at what he left behind in Lahore. There are many small details that can confirm this, and I mentioned them already, him liking, British food, drinking whiskey, talking to, business associates about meal topics, indifference. But Ali criticizes him for all these things. Ali criticizes him for not having a mustache, for example, let alone a beard. And this is where Pervez almost undergoes a form of inverse mimicry, because to get closer to his son, he's even willing to grow a beard. He's willing to listen to his interpretations of Islamic laws. He's willing to try and understand his compassion for the oppressed Muslims around the world, and does not question Ali's excitement about the future Islamic rule and Sharia laws in the morally bankrupt West. but he's defeated by his son's condemnation, constant condemnation that he's going to end up in hell. And the ending here is very interesting because at the end, Pervez and Bettina are driving in a cab and they see Ali, and I quote, on the other side of the town in a poor district where there are two mosques, which can be interpreted as the realization of his worst fears, which is that he was afraid to live in accordance with his cultural heritage simply because people who do not try to assimilate end up there, the other side of the town in a poor district. And what he wanted for his son more than anything is to be a successful, integrated person. He wanted him to be as British as possible, to mimic British behavior and lifestyle as much as possible. But at this point, he sees that his son had simply chosen something different, a different path. And he's afraid that now he will end up in this poor part of the town, struggling without education, without proper means to survive. So at the end, he stops the car and they get into a fight, which ends in physical fight between the son and father, where son is hitting his son and Ali is just standing there. He did not raise his hand, his father, and he just asked him, who is the fanatic now? Thank you very much, and sorry if I wasted some time.
No need to apologize. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions from the audience? All right, so our next presentation is actually multi-authored by Dr. Hitesh, RAVIYA, and Kanika KAPIL. So Dr. Hitesh RAVIYA is the head of the English department of the Maharaja Sayajirao Rao University of Baroda. His areas of interest include English language teaching, English studies, Gujarati diasporic studies, applied linguistics, and language teaching. He also currently serves as the Director of Communication Cell, as well as the Vice Dean of Faculty of Arts at the Maharaja Sayajirao Rao University of Baroda. And Kanika KAPIL is a PhD research scholar and an adjunct assistant professor of English at the Maharaja Sayajirao Rao University of Baroda, where she teaches business communication at the Faculty of Commerce. Her areas of interest are diasporic studies, British literature, and communication skills. So the title of their presentation is Traumatic Diasporic Lives, Women's Rights of Passage in Chitra Divakaruni's fiction. So I suppose Dr. Hitesh RAVIYA will be given the presentation today.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you for the introduction. As you clearly specified, it's a multi-author paper, yep. And Sir has, of course, assisted me in this and guided me. But right now, I'm Kanika KAPIL, and I'll be taking over the presentation.
Oh, okay.
Due to certain technical issues, I could not really make a presentation, so I'm going to be, sharing the titles. Sharing some of the pages from my work in progress paper.
That's fine. Thank you.
All right. So as the title itself is self-explanatory, traumatic diasporic lives and women's rights of passage in Chitra Divakaruni's fiction. So I'm going to just quickly begin with the brief intro, which the abstract already states that about Divakaruni's works. She is one of our very well-known, renowned. Kind of a lot of critics call her the Jane Austen, today's Jane Austen. And she writes about the varied experiences of Asian American immigrant women, specifically the Indian Bengali women, because that's where she hails from. And her novels, talk about these women who strive to create a balance between adapting to the modern, liberated worldview, so to speak, and retaining the traditional roots of their native home culture on the other hand. But so our paper basically looks into how these people, they trapeze through the cataclysmic changes in their inner and outer lives. And the theoretical framework that we have chosen for this paper is the archetypal and traumatic theory. And we have made an attempt to unravel the intricate layers accompanying their tumultuous diasporic journey. I'll begin with a quote from Divakaruni's known novel, Sister of My Heart. The quote says, "For girl babies who are so much bad luck that they cause their fathers to die even before they are born." So as we can see, most of Divakaruni's heroines are quite used to, from their childhood onwards, such regressive perspectives. So when they get any opportunity to get an entry into the so-called liberated, developed, sought after nations of the world, they don't waste a second before crossing the threshold, and they are enthused with the bright prospects of having better future and uninhibited lifestyle. And these women, as well as all the society and family members, grab this opportunity as if it were the next ticket to heaven. The archetypal motive, of course, is something that Divakaruni is known for. Most of her heroines, her protagonists, her female protagonists, they find themselves undertaking one or the other kind of journey. Either it is in search of, better future, or some pertinent life questions, answers they're looking to, or mostly, as in India, the arranged marriage is still very prevalent. So mostly they are also going to join the husband as a spouse. So here I've just, quoted from the myth critic Joseph Campbell, and what he talks about, like how a journey transforms you. And I quote, "A hero is any male or female who leaves the world of his or her everyday life to undergo a journey to a special world where challenges and fears are overcome in order to secure a reward, which is then shared with other members of the hero's community," end quote. And as we will see in the novels that we're going to be analyzing, that Divakaruni's works truly evokes this archetypal journey motive, and which reflects the quest of the her diasporic women who are seeking fulfillment. And they, mostly the Indian women, Indian Bengali women, as I mentioned, they aspire to be, the fortunate have-it-alls. They feel that they will be very easily able to balance the traditionally rooted homes, as well as, adapt very well to the modern liberated lifestyles. And they seem to be very confident initially of mastering this elusive art of being the perfect epitomes of ancient wisdom and contemporary lifestyle. However, as they journey on, as we will find out through the characters and the plots, there's a great chasm between their aspirations and reality, and all of these women have to pay a mighty expensive cost for crossing the 7 seas. And every single journey in Divakaruni's fictitious women, they include certain rites of passage which have to be endured. And this is what basically is the focus of this paper. We are going to try through the stories and characters, to explore the cost that has to be paid to sort of make it big over there. A brief, about trauma. The word trauma, though, has, as a technical definition, dictionary definition defines it as a wound, which is, or an injury which is inflicted upon the body. But over the years, lots of research has gone into discovering the psychological and the emotional aspects and the, hidden layers. And one of the prominent trauma theorists, Kathy Carrot, also talks about this and elaborates that, and I quote, that trauma is not locatable in the simple, violent or original event in an individual's past, but rather in the way that its very unassimilated nature, the way it was precisely not known in the first instant, returns to haunt the survivor later. End quote. So we will, through the characters, try to analyze that how and why trauma differs from individual to individual and plays out in, insidious ways and is manifested differently for different people on different journeys. So the first novel that I'm going to begin is Before We Visit the Goddess. This is kind of an intergenerational saga which explores, 3 different generations of Bengali mothers and daughters, and it's an interconnected intercontinental kind of a novel, which gives us a slice of life experience, from rural Bengal to retirement facility in Houston, USA. And it's divided into 3 parts, and each part for one woman, So basically there's the grandmother, Sabitri, and her story kind of highlights the trauma of migration. She migrates in search of better prospects to, from rural Bengal to, the so-called modern city, Kolkata. And she has to fight, she has her own struggle, against the societal patriarchal expectations. And her daughter, Bella, her story, on the other hand, focuses on the trauma of displacement. And Bella is, even though born in India, Kolkata, but she migrates to the US, and her journey is, marked by a sense of alienation, which we will be discussing in the, next slides. And the story also highlights the emotional toll that migration can take on individuals and families. So before embarking on this journey, Bella feels that, definitely like any other immigrant, she feels that this is going to be, the next ticket to heaven. And she voluntarily uproots herself, no one has coerced her into it or anything. And, she just escapes and leaves behind her mother and her motherland to join her to-be husband, Sanjay. So her story is really quite, her condition is quite a, actually a pitiable one, because, she's from India, she's been brought up with very strict, regressive, patriarchal boundaries. And she believes that she's stepping into this world, free from all these regressive shackles. So initially, I'm going to quote from, her first reaction when she reaches the airport, she meets her husband-to-be and she kisses him on the mouth. And she's just very happy that no one catcalled, no one harassed them or took umbrage or even noticed. And but slowly we come to know, as the story unfolds, that this freedom and modernity is, that is available freely to the native woman over there, is not going to be really experienced by her at all. As she has totally given up studies and severed her all family ties, she, slowly realizes she has no choice but to be utterly dependent on her husband in each and every aspect of her life, financially, emotionally. She tries to align her principles and her skill set to suit the opinions and expectations of her husband. Especially she has a very trying time during her unplanned pregnancy, because she craves to be back home in India, getting pampered by her mother, because that's the tradition over here, and she fantasizes, and there's so many quotes in the novel which talk about that, and as is a norm in the culture, in the Bengali culture, that Savitri would have made sure she got a mustard oil massage each day and fresh fried rui fish for protein. So all of these things she is, just fantasizing about, and she has to listen to her husband, and she has to undergo the rites of passage, so to speak, where finally she realizes that, she has to just survive somehow, and she begins to accept, in her own words, this as a cost of living in America. And as the years go by, she realizes that, America might have saved their lives, hers and her husband's, but it had diminished them. So she talks about this, diminishing quality that, maybe we have, in some ways gained something, moving away from the whole culture, but we definitely, all of us have paid a very heavy cost. The quality of life certainly has diminished for her. And, the same kind of carried is forward, in her daughter's case. Her daughter, though she's born and brought up in the US, and she could have been a very, kind of a model, perfect model for the best of East meets West. However, in her case, the upbringing is kind of, everything is, goes awry. She has the trauma, she, faces of identity crisis, and she's a truly, hyphenated identity. Because Bella's husband, Sanjay, was not a religious person. So she, kind of doesn't really grow up, acquainted with any of the Hindu traditions and the rituals. Like, I mentioned that quote that where her mother has to fight up, him just to set up an altar in the kitchen, where a tiny 10-armed goddess statue shared space with her spices. And as, Sanjay was opposed to her mother, so Bella could never even, call her to the US US or take her daughter to meet her in India. So due to Sanjay, both mother and daughter are not only physically away from India, but also detached from the rich Indian traditions and rituals. And as a result, Tara's upbringing is completely devoid of any knowledge about her ancient cultural heritage, as is depicted in these lines, where a stranger who sees her for the first time describes her, and I quote, she was a puzzle with her Indian features and Texan boots, her defined piercings, the skin stretched thin across her forehead. He had read somewhere that it was a style that lesbians affected. What kind of Indian family, even in America, would produce such a hybrid, end quote. So the famous diasporic critic, Stuart Hall, talks about this, and he says that, he quotes Frank Fanon, and, he says, the inner expropriation of cultural identity cripples and deforms, and if silences are not resisted, they produce, in Frank Fanon's vivid phrase, individuals without an anchor, without horizon, colorless, stateless, rootless, a race of angels, end quote. And Tara, in this novel, truly epitomizes this race. The next novel that we have looked into is, actually there are two novels, Sister of My Heart, and then there is The Wine of Desire. This one is a sequel to this particular novel. Now, both these talk about two girls, and then later on, of course, they, mature into women, and Sudha and Anju, and they kind of hail from very, privileged family back home, Brahminical, Hindu, Bengali family in Kolkata, and where their the main aim of the elderly matriarchs of the family is to, make them prim and proper, submissive, typical good Indian girls, so to speak, who will settle very well in any, kind of good family. And their efforts do bear fruits, where both, marry into wealthy, established households. And but as the story unfolds, we realize that, Anju, who has after marriage, gone to the US, she suffers a traumatic miscarriage and finds herself sinking into deep depression. And as back home in India, she's brought up in a very rich and joint family, and she's pampered from birth. Her life, she's totally, feels lost in those circumstances. And though she is a very independent kind of a person, her life completely spirals out of control when she finds herself devoid of emotional support during her, most challenging circumstances. And here, I think one of the quotes by the post-colonial expert Sandra Ponsonz is very apt here, that separation from tradition and obligations, immigration is not a process devoid of pain and alienation. So one of the rites of passage that Anju has to endure while living in the most sought after country, so to speak, is getting used to the independent but isolated, alienated existence. And even though she's basically a strong person, she's unable to manage on her own, and she to find she's at loss how to find ways to mitigate the trauma. And The Wine of Desire, we like a sequel, we see Anju begging her soul sister, her best friend Sudha, to come to the US and kind of assist her in getting out of the depression. At the same time, she wants Sudha and her little baby girl to kind of establish themselves. So but through Sudha's case also, we find another kind of a trauma, which is of displacement and identity crisis. So even though she's trying, Sudha's trying her best to feel comfortable in this developed atmosphere, liberated environment, but at the core, she still remains a very typical Indian woman. And, this dual consciousness. So even if she's watching TV and some woman contestant, spontaneously, wins some game and kisses the show host, Sudha is absolutely scandalized. And because she feels this is a very inappropriate behavior of any, self-respecting female. So the diktats, laid down centuries ago for Indian women mean more to her than the societal norms which provide complete freedom to women to seek pleasures and live for themselves in the US. So even later when she comes to know that Anju's husband is, very attracted to her, and she herself is not really immune to that attraction, again, she is completely burdened with guilty conscience, and she keeps reminding herself and her, baby daughter that, you know, these are the boundaries and one must not cross because chaos awaits on the other side of the drawn line. So this, you know, dilemma kind of also makes her flee from another home, you know. And so basically we find, you know, her questioning her own morality and sexuality, and she's doubly estranged, you know, physically also and psychologically. So the next novel that we are looking into, Oleander Girl, the similar pattern can be seen in this coming of age novel, which is around this, you know, girl called Corby, who comes to the US in search of her true parentage and origin. And but you know, in her case, as soon as she lands at the airport, and you know, just the first few days, you know, her whatever American dreams that she has are shattered for good. And she comes to know that there is a lot of struggle involved, you know, just to survive. The diasporic Indians have to, you know, endure a lot at the personal as well as societal level, especially post 9/11. And she gets an experience of the same dilemma. And even in the midst of what is interesting, again, you know, in this one case, it's a very small little example, you know, where she's just, she feels that, okay, you know, I don't want to depend on funds, right? So to carry on with her search for her parentage. So she decides to get her a haircut. I mean, she's blessed with, you know, beautiful, glorious hair, and that is going to fetch her good money. So even a small little thing like that, she is unable to, you know, I mean, think of her hair as her own, you know, as I've taken that quote from the novel. You know, she says at each step, you know, when the haircut is going on, she, you know, what's going on in her mind. And I start the quote that hair belonged to Bimal and Sarojini's granddaughter, to Rajat's fiance, to Papa and Maman Bose's daughter-in-law to be, end quote. So we can see that, you know, even a experience like getting a haircut is quite traumatic for her, because again, you know, and she's chastised by others as well over there who feel that, oh, you know, she's going to be a bride and look what she's done, you know, she's gotten a haircut, and now when she goes back, her in-laws to be are surely going to you know, consider her improper bride and damaged goods. So this double consciousness, you know, that the diasporic critic Du Bois has spoken about with regard to African American identity is kind of quite, you know, relevant here too. You know, he talks about this two-ness and two souls and two thoughts and two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. So just to conclude, you know, we have seen through all the works, mostly, you know, 4 novels that we have focused on, that her works definitely portray trauma in a very nuanced manner, as a multifaceted one. And we can see in all the, you know, cases, it is different for different individuals. And but it is something, the journey, you know, however traumatic, whatever rites of passage you might have to endure, everyone has to take this journey, every one of her heroines, that is. And we see, you know, how that this is being done here. And the main objective of this paper, which was to highlight the, you know, psychological impact of trauma, and how, you know, they attempt to negotiate their identities among a new cultural landscape, you know. That was the main thing, and we have tried to explore that. And these rights of these hyphenated identities, we can definitely conclude that male dominance, male privilege, and patriarchal expectations continue to govern these women, even in the midst of, you know, a liberated and emancipated society. With that, I would like to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. So this is the end of the first session. But before concluding the session, I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone. The contributions and the very presence of everyone today are particularly meaningful to us, because this is the first iteration of our conference. So the second session will begin 2:20. I think it's best that we take at least a 10-minute break before continuing with the second session. So the second session begins in approximately 10 minutes. And until then, take care.